Chapter 40. In the afternoon, the caravan arrived at their new destination. It was a small town called Gold Creek Town. The town was prosperous for a while because there was a river where gold could be found there. Unfortunately, the town gradually declined after the gold mine was completely mined. Before the caravan even got close to the town, the alarm bell rang. Immediately after, some people rode over to check. This was still considered a border area of the wilderness, so the people living here were very alert. After confirming that it was a caravan, the people in the town let them pass. At the same time, some people came over to ask about the goods. In places far away from the city, some people would sell their goods to the caravan at a low price, and the caravan would bring them to the city to sell. At the same time, they would also buy some things from the merchants and sell them in the nearby towns. Unless they had a large number of guards like this caravan from the north, ordinary merchants would not trade long distances. This was because it was more dangerous and troublesome to travel. The little girl was in a good mood today. Perhaps it was because the journey was relatively peaceful. She jumped off the horse as soon as they arrived at the town and looked around curiously. The captain of the guards told Soren that he would be staying in the town for the night. He could look around as he pleased and go to the inn at the east gate at night. The whole town was surrounded by a wall. The wall was built with 2 layers of sturdy logs. Each log was about 20 centimeters thick, and the 2 ends were sharpened and sunk into the ground. There was a watchtower every 100 meters or so, and one could climb up using ladders from below. There were 2 gates in the east and west of the town. Both of them were very thick and heavy, and it looked like a sturdy fortress. This was to guard against attacks from gnolls and possible bandits. But in a town like this, there was always someone on guard at night because gnolls could sneak in. "Brother, look." The little girl held Soren's hand and looked around. When she heard the shouts, she pulled him over curiously. There were 2 people training. One was a middle-aged man, and the other was a younger man. They looked similar, so they were either father and son or uncle and nephew. "Watch your right side." The middle-aged man with a wooden shield and a wooden sword said in a low voice, "When the enemy attacks from this direction, you have to learn how to use your shield. Watch carefully. When you block, make sure your arms are at a certain distance. Only then will you have room to move. When you use your shield, don't take too big a step. What is truly fatal is the sword in your hand, not this shield. What you need to do is to use the impact of the shield to make the opponent lose his balance, and then stab with your weapon." The 2 of them were training seriously. The middle-aged man didn't look back at all, but the young man was slightly distracted. Then the middle-aged man smashed him to the ground with his shield. "This is the second thing I want to tell you. You can't be distracted in battle. Continue training." The young man gritted his teeth and got up. His expression was much more serious. At the same time, he launched a more valiant attack. Maybe it was because someone was looking at him, which aroused his competitive spirit. The middle-aged man was still calm and unhurried. While blocking, he said in a deep voice, "Look carefully." Facing the enemy's hacking attacks. Shields are not the only means of defense. You also need to learn how to use weapons to parry. Cleave attacks align. At this time, if you can't dodge, you need to think of a way to block the enemy's attack. Just like that. The middle-aged man swung his sword to parry, then rushed forward and knocked the young man to the ground with his shoulder. Swords aren't the only things that can defeat the enemy. Our bodies are also a kind of weapon. Stand up. It was a very realistic and merciless training method. Soren looked at the blood coming out of the young man's nose. His expression gradually became serious and he carefully observed them. The middle-aged man looked at them. However, he didn't pay much attention to them. After twirling the wooden sword in his hand, he continued, "If the enemy stabs at you, at this time it's best not to parry. You need to learn how to use your body to dodge. Stabs attack a point, so it's very difficult to parry. However, as long as you move your body, you can easily avoid the attack. However, when the enemy stabs at you, it's often just the beginning of the attack. You need to learn how to judge in an instant. Pay attention to their shoulders. Any attack has a trajectory. When they need to explode with power, their body will inevitably make corresponding movements. For example, you can do this." The middle-aged man dodged the sword, then twisted his waist and took a step forward to swing his sword at the young man's wrist. The wooden sword fell to the ground with a clang. The young man who had been defeated consecutively was finally discouraged. He lay on the ground, panting. He didn't even pick up the sword. The middle-aged man looked at the sky and slowly said, "Today's training ends here. If you want to become a qualified warrior, you still have a lot to learn. Just relying on brute strength to fight is just courting death." The middle-aged man wiped his sweat with the clothes on the side, then glanced at Soren and the scimitar on his body. He said seriously, "Outsider. I'm the captain of the militia here. Although this place doesn't exclude outsiders, it's not welcoming either. You better not cause any trouble." Threat. The middle-aged man's tone was very serious, and there was no provocation in his expression. It was as if he was talking about something very normal, but it inexplicably gave people a sense of pressure. "I never like to cause trouble." Soren smiled and said calmly, "But if someone provokes me, I'll make them regret it. We're just passing by." The middle-aged man nodded. "That's for the best." This was a third-grade warrior, and it was very likely that he used to be a famous adventurer. Soren noticed that his legs were a little inconvenient. Perhaps he had suffered a serious injury that caused his bones to deviate. Adventures like this were quite common. Many had to retire after being injured and return to their hometown to live a normal life. There were many people in this world with stories. "Big brother." The little girl picked up a branch and gestured. "That man just now looked quite strong. But the people he taught are so stupid. They can't even remember such simple things. Look." Soren looked at the little girl's crooked posture. She was small and weak, and even her posture was a little off. But Soren didn't discourage her. He rubbed her little head and said, "It's quite simple. But they're all very practical skills. Of course he's not as smart as my Vivian. Let's go. I'll take you to buy some good food." When Soren was watching the man train, a row of small words appeared in front of his eyes. Skill level up. You've learned something while watching others train. You've grasped a certain combat skill. Parry +1, block +1, evasion, movement, +1. Soren didn't expect to unlock 2 new basic skills just like that. He thought that he would have to wait until he started training on parrying and blocking in the future before he could unlock these 2 basic skills. 1 or 2 points in a basic skill weren't very useful. If he wanted to gain a significant increase, he would need to gain at least 10 points. Normally, a basic skill would gain a significant increase of around 50 points. For example, a shield warrior's 100 points of block. That was the level of a professional who could use a shield to block, just like Soren's ability in stealth. A basic skill was chosen to specialize in a certain direction. Then, the other basic skills that were triggered would automatically level up over time. The skill points gained from leveling up would rarely be invested into these skills, because there were specializations in different professions. Most of the basic skills that were related to professions would be leveled up faster. For example, Soren's evasion was already at 6 points, and he hadn't gone through any specialized training. If he trained in evasion, rolling, and evasion, movement, his evasion could quickly reach 20 points or more. Normally, a basic evasion skill of around 50 points could passively increase one's evasion by 1 point. This evasion was an instinctive evasion. It was an instinctive reaction when a person was attacked. Only certain specializations could increase this. For example, intuitive evasion, evasion proficiency, super evasion, and so on. These were all combat specializations that were very difficult to obtain through training, and their effects were also very obvious. Basic skills were relatively normal abilities. Only specializations were skills that could significantly increase one's strength. Of course, the difficulty of mastering them was also very high. Some specializations had prerequisites for basic skills. For example, the combat specialization, defense and offense, 100 points of parry, and the combat specialization, powerful shield bash, 150 points of parry, all of which required mastery of basic skills. Basic skills below 50 points were relatively easy to master, but to level them up, one would need to be a professional. For example, the negotiation and valuation skills of a professional businessman. The taunting ability of a barbarian. Sometimes, when you meet these simple-minded and muscular guys, you would really be angered by their words. These were a group of taunting professionals. One of the favorite things of the player barbarian was to show off his muscles in front of his enemies and taunt them, "A bunch of weaklings." Also, the taunting ability of the witches with poisonous tongues was also very strong. There were some players who had a low profession level, only LV6, because of their poisonous tongues, but their taunting ability was actually over 200 points, master level. Once they used their poisonous tongues, they would instantly become the target of everyone. Too much taunting would create an aura. Even if they didn't understand what you were saying, their expressions would be filled with hatred. Chapter 41. The two of them quickly returned to the inn. Soren bought a clay pot, a pound of pork and a pound of beans. He had promised to make some delicious food for Vivian, but it wasn't convenient to do so in the wild, so he decided to make it up to her by making her something to eat at night. There were a lot of people gathered outside the inn. Some of them were residents of the town who wanted to see if there were any cheap goods, and some were local hunters who wanted to sell their furs to them at a cheaper price so that they didn't have to go to the city to sell their furs. There were also some people who came to watch, mainly to see the ankegs on the carriages. It's really an ankeg. Looks like they killed at least 3 of them. These people are really strong. There were militiamen and children in the crowd. For these people who lived in the outskirts of the town, they didn't know much about the legendary monsters, but ankegs were one of the most dangerous creatures they knew. Let's go in. Soren glanced at the others and was about to go in and rest. However, when a slightly skinny but well-built figure appeared, he couldn't help but stop in his tracks. The guard captain also stopped what he was doing and raised his head to look at the man who just appeared. The other party was not very old, probably in his 20s. His face was quite handsome, and the outline of his face seemed to have been carved by a knife. His eyes were very spirited and sharp, and his eyebrows were straight like swords. This kind of appearance gave people a very strong impression, not to mention his restrained but sharp aura. A sword saint? Soren glanced at the opponent's weapon with a playful expression on his face. He muttered to himself, I didn't expect this town to be so full of hidden talents. There's actually an advanced sword saint living here. Sword saint. It wasn't a name for a person's strength. It was a profession that extended from the warrior class. The word, saint, represented a pursuit and belief in many places, such as the paladins, holy fist guards, and clerics. Sword saint was a high-level profession that advanced from the warrior class. The requirements to become a sword saint were more stringent, and it was also a profession that gave up on using armor. If one wasn't talented, they would need to reach grade 3 before they could successfully become a sword saint. Sword saints did not have a specific weapon, but they usually used a straight blade. This kind of weapon was still called a sword by many. They were good at finding the enemy's fatal weakness, and at the same time, they knew how to maximize their own strength. The chi-raising slash ability was gradually passed down to the ordinary warriors by the sword saints. Many sword saints had received the training methods of weapon masters. They even learned the meditation of Wushu monks. The sword saint observed the caravan for a while before a look of disappointment appeared on his face. He quickly left the crowd and walked towards the back of the town. The sword saint was a profession that liked to find people to spar with. They hoped to hone their skills through battle. If they were active in the beastman's territory, the blade sword saint would like to find foreign experts to challenge. Vivian. You go in first. I'll be back soon. Soren's curiosity was piqued. He quietly followed the man outside, but he didn't follow him too closely. The sky gradually darkened. The sword saint did not go back. Instead, he went directly to a big tree. He stabbed the straight blade on his back into the ground, then sat cross-legged behind the blade. He didn't have exaggerated muscles, but his sharp arms held the sword hilt. He slowly closed his eyes and breathed. He sat there for half a day. Soren's figure was very hazy in the shadows. He seriously looked at the sword saint in the distance with a serious expression. The sword saint did not sit on the ground. In fact, from the beginning until now, the sword saint's body was about 1 centimeter above the ground. His entire weight was supported by his arms. His hands were holding the sword hilt from the beginning, and his whole body weight was also placed on the sword hilt. His breathing did not change much from the beginning to the end. His chest rose and fell slightly as if he had entered meditation. However, Soren was very sure of one thing. Once he was within 20 meters of the sword saint would be able to detect him in an instant. Most sword saints were grade 3 or higher. In other words, the sword saint's profession level was probably 10 or higher. If such a person were to fight, Soren's chances of winning were less than 30%. So he quietly retreated without disturbing the sword saint who was training. The sword saint was the most powerful profession for warriors. The second most powerful profession was the weapon master, and the third most powerful was the berserker. Because sword saints did not wear any armor, it was very easy for them to fall. Especially in the future, during the Age of Chaos, sword saints would easily become the main target in large-scale battles. So Soren had not met many legendary sword saints. The legendary sword saint's weakness insight could even find the weakest point in the defensive force field energy cast by spellcasters. Professionals did not always go out adventuring. If they felt tired or if their ability reached the critical point of a breakthrough, they would find a quiet place to try to advance. Some special professions would even return to the place where they were trained. Looks like I have to find time to start training. In a small town there were so many professionals, which undoubtedly increased the pressure on Soren. He did not have such a strong feeling before. But now he found that these natives were not simple. Even if there was a mysterious stream of data in his mind, if he did not work hard, he might not be able to surpass these natives in the future and face the gods in the coming Avatar crisis. Phew. Soren silently put his hand on the curved sword and said to himself, no wonder the gods killed by the players were less than 1/10 of the natives in the story. This gap is not something that can be made up with data. The gods fell. In the past, there were less than 2 digits of divinity among the players, but there were hundreds of natives in the story who obtained divinity. It was not just the difference in profession level. Soren went back to the hotel and began to prepare dinner. The caravan guards were busy with their own things, and the mysterious hostess did not show up for 2 days. Wizards rarely dealt with ordinary people, so no one felt strange. Vivian was learning to read in the room, and the little girl had almost finished learning the common language. She did not ask where Soren went. When Soren came back, she moved a small stool and sat next to him. Soren was cutting the pork he bought into pieces, and then poured the beans into a clay pot. Then he took the clay pot to the hotel kitchen, carefully sealed the pot, and covered it with the ashes of the burned firewood. Then he clapped his hands and said, let's eat something first. It should be cooked when it gets dark. This was a relatively simple food and it tasted good. Soren used to make it himself when he was free. The only requirement was patience. Because it was stewed, it took about 3 hours. Night fell. The caravan guards were drinking and chatting in front of the hotel. Occasionally, some of them would go out and fight. Some merchants gathered together to count their goods. Today they bought some furs in the town, and they should be able to make some money by shipping them to the next city. Soren sat at the back and played with his curved sword. However, he did not use his right hand but his left. Dual wielding. This was a very difficult ability to train, and it might take a long time to learn. You either have to spend some ability points to learn it or you have to train hard. However, Soren already had the ability, nimble left hand, so it was much easier for him to learn dual wielding. No one knew who started the commotion, but someone urged Soren to go down and play as well. Soren happened to have such an idea, but he used his left hand when he made the move. It was a young man from the north. The guard captain was also eager to test Soren's skills, but he gave up when he saw that Soren was using his left hand. However, his expression was quite strange because it was rare to see people using dual weapons. This required a lot of skill. Currently, the best creatures using dual weapons were the elves. Only those with long lifespans had the time to practice this skill. Vivian stood on the table that was taller than her and watched. Because she was too short. In the empty arena, Soren walked around with a serious expression. Holding the curved sword in a reverse grip affected his performance, but it was a good way to train the agility of his left hand. Even though he was using his left hand, he was still not at a disadvantage. He even looked like he was testing his moves on his opponent. The little girl stood on the table and watched very seriously. She held a table knife in her small white hand. She watched the fight on the arena and even used the table knife to make a few moves. She frowned and thought from time to time. Her appearance was a bit out of place, but her expression was very serious. Gradually, when she made a few moves, there were even some similarities. No one noticed the little girl in the corner. They were all focused on the fight on the arena. Soren's dodging skills amazed many people, especially his footwork and the difficult movements he made when he dodged the attacks. It was impossible for an ordinary person to do something like this without specialized flexibility training. On the second floor of the inn, the mysterious mistress of the merchant group appeared out of nowhere. She glanced at Soren, who was fighting on the arena, and quickly lost interest. However, when her gaze landed on Vivian in the corner, her face lit up. She looked surprised, interested, and amused. The little girl stood on the table and made some gestures. Then, she put down the table knife and mumbled to herself, "It doesn't seem that difficult. Big Brother isn't fighting seriously at all. If he had used the move that allowed him to run horizontally on the wall, he would have killed that guy with one slash. It's just a few moves over and over. Big Brother's opponent isn't even as good as that guy during the day." The little girl pursed her lips and sneakily glanced at the others. Then, she quietly picked up the wine pot with both hands and poured herself a cup of ale. "Because she's too weak, Vivian took a sip and smacked her lips. "It tastes weird," she mumbled to herself. "Why do they like this?" The little girl took a few more sips out of curiosity. Soon, a blush appeared on her pretty face. Why do I feel a bit dizzy?" Vivian's petite body started to sway. When Soren came back from the arena, the little girl was already drunk. Her cheeks were red and she hurriedly hid the cup behind her back. Soren noticed that she was secretly drinking. When he saw the drunk Vivian in front of him, his face instantly darkened. Slap. A slap on her butt. Soren directly put her in his arms and threw her to the room on the second floor to sleep. The night was cold. Soren went to the kitchen to take a look at the pot, then covered it with the ashes of the charcoal fire. He then lit an oil lamp, took it to the room on the second floor, took out a book from his multidimensional bag, and started reading silently. Occasionally, his eyes fell on Vivian, who was sleeping soundly. Her cheeks were still a bit red from the alcohol. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You're quite brave." He reached out and pinched Vivian's little nose. The little girl felt uncomfortable and waved her little hand. Then she turned over and fell asleep. She was really drunk. Although she only drank a small cup of ale. The night was getting darker. Soren put away the book, blew out the oil lamp and went to sleep. The little girl drowsily leaned over and naturally reached out to hug his arm. Then she smacked her lips and muttered a few words in her sleep. The night passed just like that. Chapter 42. The caravan was ready to leave early in the morning. When Vivian woke up, Soren had already packed everything and was holding a warm jar in his hand. "Brother." Vivian held onto the corner of her clothes and walked over timidly. She whispered, "I was wrong. I won't drink in secret anymore." This bold little girl, how old was she? She actually dared to drink in secret. Soren originally wanted to scold her, but when he saw the little girl's pitiful appearance, he couldn't help but say with a dark face, "Don't do it again. If you do it again, then I'll hit your butt with the board." The little girl quietly sighed in relief. When Soren wasn't paying attention, she stuck out her tongue playfully and obediently followed him downstairs. Yesterday she was also curious. She didn't know why so many people liked to drink. Originally she just wanted to give it a try. She didn't expect that after just a few sips she would feel dizzy and drunk. Fortunately, her brother didn't scold her. Vivian reached out and touched her butt. She was slapped in a daze yesterday and it still hurt a little this morning. It seemed like her brother was really angry. In the future, she definitely couldn't drink anymore. The little girl secretly warned herself, and then followed Soren to the hall. Soren didn't drink. Sometimes he didn't even touch a drop of alcohol. Alcohol was a thief's most fatal poison. It would reduce a thief's perception, willpower, and agility. It would make them lose their vigilance and at the same time, affect their clarity of mind. Perhaps some warriors could slightly increase their fighting strength after drinking, but once a thief drank, their original advantage would be completely lost. Soren once saw a half-legendary thief get chopped into pieces by two level 6 rookies. The reason was that this guy drank himself into a drunken stupor. All professions that relied on skills had to ensure that they had a clear mind at all times. If he needed to relax, Soren would borrow the halfling's tobacco. There was a time when he carried a sandalwood pipe with him. The distillation method invented by the wizards had been popularized for a long time. Alchemy's potion purification techniques had long been used on alcohol, and there were some strong liquors that even legendary professions could not withstand. Soren opened the jar. After simmering for an entire night, the aroma inside was very strong. Even the others couldn't help but look over when they smelled the aroma. Soren smiled as he poured out a big bowl. He first gave a portion to Vivian, then gave it to the guards of the caravan. These days the food was prepared by the caravan, so it was only right for them to have a taste. Soren asked the hotel to prepare some fried eggs and 2 big bowls of thick porridge. The journey was tough, so Vivian had to eat more. The mysterious mistress of the caravan also came down at the same time. She sat down across from Soren after smelling the aroma and poured herself some of the wine. Her casual behavior made it hard for Soren to refuse. "Shouldn't you take off your veil when eating?" Soren lowered his head and continued eating. "Don't you find it inconvenient?" The mistress of the caravan elegantly picked up the spoon and gently blew on it. Her veil fluttered a little, revealing her sharp chin. "I'm used to it," she said calmly. "It's not bad. I didn't expect you to be so talented." She actually ate very little. She only took a few bites before putting it down. She glanced at Soren and then at the little girl who was busy eating. Whis. The little girl was eating happily. She was not picky when it came to food. She would find it delicious if it tasted slightly better. He didn't know why. The mysterious mistress of the caravan was more talkative than before. She even tried to talk to Soren while she was eating, which made him feel like she was hiding evil intentions. Food shouldn't be wasted. Soren quickly finished his food. He raised his head and looked at the mistress of the caravan in front of him. He naturally reached out for her bowl and poured the leftover food into his own bowl. It was a very rude and frivolous behavior. It could even be said that he was flirting with her, especially when it came to a noble lady like her. The mistress of the caravan was embarrassed and angry. Her plump chest heaved up and down inconspicuously for a moment before she gradually calmed down. Something was wrong. Soren was still eating in silence. He acted like a stingy and thrifty person. He even snuck a peek at the mistress of the caravan's breasts, which looked like a poor disguise. However, he was now much more cautious of the mistress of the caravan. She was still looking at him with a sense of superiority. She was neither cold nor indifferent to him all the way here. It was impossible for her to suddenly become so close to him. Judging from her behavior just now, this kind of behavior obviously made her angry, but she endured it. Wizards were a group of very rational people. She must be plotting something and it shouldn't be him. The only possibility was Vivian. Did she notice the little girl's amazing talent? It was obvious. Soren's judgment was correct. After the caravan set off, the mistress of the caravan pretended to casually ask about their past. This sort of word-of-mouth technique was nothing to a thief. Soren easily saw through her intentions, but he couldn't tell if she was being nice or not. It was the best possibility. She must have noticed Vivian's amazing talent and wanted to take her in as an apprentice. That was why she purposely got close to them and wanted to know more about their past. However, there was also the possibility that she had other intentions. It was quite possible that she had other intentions. Soren found it hard to trust a stranger, especially a witch. Should we leave? This was the thought that crossed Soren's mind as the caravan set off. The northern witches were not kind beings. If he waited for her to open her mouth and refuse, she might get angry. Wizards were not to be judged by common sense. There were many Frankensteins in this group. Most of the time, wizards didn't like to be reasonable. At least not until you had the ability to reason with them. They didn't like to be reasonable. Spellcasters always had a sense of superiority in their hearts, and it was even more so for a witch with a high status. After all, they were women. However, they were now very close to Whiterun City. Once they reached the city, they would naturally part ways. The caravan would need to go from the south to the north, while Soren would need to go to Autumnfall and then to the Forest of Dreams to enter the Elven Kingdom. If they rashly left now, it might backfire and make it seem as if they had ulterior motives. The journey was very peaceful. In the range of human activities, the number of monsters would naturally be a lot less. The caravan also met a group of bearded dwarves on the way. There was an Iron Ridge mountain north of here, which used to be the territory of the ogres. Later, a group of dwarves moved there and finally built a city there. The Iron Ridge dwarves would trade with other nearby races, mainly humans and half-elves. They would exchange high-quality weapons for liquor and food. Dwarves were creatures that did not like farming. They would rather face hard stones than dig for food in the mud. Among all the races, it seemed that only humans were the most willing to farm, and only they liked to cultivate carefully. Orcs could farm? Don't joke around. They just scattered seeds in the ground and waited for their luck this year. If they had the time to cultivate carefully, they might as well kill two beasts. At least they could eat meat. As for the elves, no one thought that this group of creatures that pursued beauty would be willing to cultivate in the mud. Even if the mud meant fertile land. Traveling could be boring sometimes. Especially when nothing special happened. Things did not always happen, so at that time, all you needed to do was to keep moving toward your destination. It was also a good thing that nothing happened. Because unexpected events in the wild always meant trouble and could even lead to death. So, when the caravan finally reached the vicinity of Whiterun, both the merchants and the guards could not help but breathe a sigh of relief because they had reached the final destination of their journey. The caravan would stay in Whiterun for nearly a month. During this time, the merchants would disperse and do their own things. They would sell all kinds of goods in their hands and buy things that they thought could make money in the vicinity of Whiterun. Some of the merchants would also organize small groups to go to the half-elven villages here. The goods in their hands were obviously elven, and occasionally they could be sold at a high price to the nouveau riche. The villages were everywhere. When the merchants were done with their business, they would gather together and take a detour back to the north. Along the way they would pass by the seaside. The merchants in the north would sell some of their goods and bring new seafood to the north. This should be the end of the journey. Soren took the kindler that he got from selling the ankegs and left. The others would continue their journey of making money if Soren did not hear any bad news. Chapter 43. Whiterun City. Whiterun City was much more prosperous than Amber City. Although it was not as convenient as Amber City, Its history was one of the best in the south. There were many things that needed no further mention. The head of a red dragon was still hanging in the center of the city, although only its skeleton remained. The adventurers who built Whiterun City had slain an evil red dragon here. The wealth of the red dragon allowed them to expand Whiterun City's influence and eventually made it the center of trade in the southwest. There was a luxurious old house north of the city hall. It was said that the previous owner was a baron. Unfortunately, he later contracted a strange disease and died not long after. The old house had changed hands several times before welcoming a new owner. It was said that the new owner was a widowed noblewoman who had caused quite a stir in Whiterun City because of her beauty and wealth. Unfortunately, the widowed noblewoman lived in seclusion. Not only was she not interested in any noble banquets, but she also rarely interacted with other nobles. Gradually, she was ostracized from the circle of nobles. Only her servants could drive her to the manor outside the city every once in a while. The widowed noblewoman was filthy rich. Not only did she buy the busiest shops in Whiterun City, but she also owned a large manor outside the city. Of course, it was said that she had a powerful backer. Otherwise, it would be impossible for a prostitute to hold on to such wealth. The mysterious mistress of the caravan had arrived. A servant who had been waiting for her respectfully welcomed her arrival. A maid took off her shawl and led her to a large room. The floor was covered with a soft velvet carpet. This kind of high-quality alchemy carpet was sought after by many lower-class nobles, but it was now covered in cheap fabric. A flirtatious woman was lying on a large rocking chair made of ebony wood, reading a book. Her long black hair was casually draped behind her back, and she was wearing a pure white nightgown. The neckline of the nightgown was slightly open, revealing a plump, full chest. "Mother." The mistress of the caravan bowed slightly and said slowly, "I've brought the thing you wanted." "I don't understand. Why do I have to personally deliver a deck of cards? You should know that I'm in the middle of some important research." The seductive woman casually stood up. Her pajamas slipped down a little, but she wasn't interested in tidying it up. She didn't seem to mind showing off her beautiful figure in front of her daughter. Instead, she chuckled and playfully said, "Gloria, you haven't noticed anything special about it after all this time? It's not a manifestation of nature card. Instead, it is the highest achievement of alchemy in a certain era, the cards of fate." She was a northern witch. It was impossible to judge a witch's age based on her appearance. The Droll Order is still troubled by the problem of balancing the energy at the withered tree's root. The Witch Council has even sent out 12 high-grade witches to help them. Their anger has been building up for a long time. The Congress itself has a lot of resentment about cleaning up the mess you left behind. The seductive woman could no longer maintain her composure. She furrowed her slender eyebrows and said with a straight face, "That's enough. Those old-fashioned fellows don't understand the significance of my experiment at all. If I had succeeded, I could have started a new era." The mistress of the caravan looked at her and did not back down. Instead, she retorted, "Mother? But your experiment failed. That's why you have to bear the consequences." It was as if a barrel of gunpowder had exploded. The seductive woman furrowed her brows and threw the book in her hand to the ground. "That's enough. Is this how you talk to your mother?" The mistress of the caravan's expression softened. She bent down and picked up the book. "Mother, I respect you and I love you. But that doesn't change my position as a witch. You once told me that when our power can't solve the problem, faith is our last card. Many spells of the northern witches rely on cards to cast." The seductive woman sighed softly and waved her hand tiredly. "You can leave now." The mistress of the caravan hesitated for a moment. "I encountered some interesting things on my way here. If you want to listen, I can tell you about it." The coquettish woman glanced at her and immediately revealed an expression of listening attentively. Although she was only restricted to the vicinity of Whiterun in name, someone had been secretly monitoring her. Her range of activity was limited to her house and the manor outside. She would only go to the manor when she was dealing with missions from the Witch Council. Any unusual behavior would trigger an annoying warning, and it could lead to a more severe banishment, imprisonment. The Northern Droll Order had classified her as the most dangerous target. Almost all the Droll organizations in the world knew her name. Ever since she was banished to Whiterun, several elven Droll had been secretly monitoring her every move. The mistress of the caravan organized her thoughts and slowly said, "I met two interesting people on my way here. A man and a little girl. A brother and a sister. The man is actually very ordinary. He's just a slightly better rogue. But I later found out that he's not ordinary either. His soul is actually weaker than a normal person's. If he didn't make a deal with a demon, then his soul must have been severely damaged. If it's the former, then he should have the aura of the abyss. If it's the latter, then it's very difficult for him to survive. Hearing this, the coquettish woman showed an interested expression and suddenly interrupted, "Good girl. Then why didn't you kill him? You should be able to find out if you imprison his soul." The mistress of the caravan's expression turned sour. She took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Mother, I'm just curious. I shouldn't take a person's life for that." The seductive woman curled her lips and said indifferently, "Maybe that person's soul is valuable? All right. Continue." The mistress of the caravan sighed in her heart, as if she was helpless against her mother. She continued, "What really surprised me was the little girl. She's very special. Although it's hard for me to say exactly what's special about her, her talent is indeed amazing. If it weren't for the fact that she doesn't have a trace of divine power, I would have thought that she's the legendary child of God. It's a pity that they're very cautious. They seem to be very cautious of everyone. It's hard for me to get more information from them." The seductive woman showed a disapproving expression. Her eyes flickered as she said, "Pedantic. In such a situation, a charm spell can be used to solve it. If the target's will is strong, consider using a berserk charm spell. Why go through so much trouble?" The mistress of the caravan frowned again and said slowly, "The power of magic shouldn't be abused. Plus they're not evil people. I can feel that they're very close to each other. Sometimes even I'm envious of them. Remember your bottom line, and you won't lose your way in the pursuit of power." The seductive woman curled her lips and pulled up her pajamas to cover her exposed bosom. She said playfully, "Good girl. Your stance seems to have deviated from the neutral stance that the witches follow. If I didn't know better, I would have thought that you were one of those stubborn paladins." The mistress of the caravan seemed to have lost interest in continuing the conversation. As she turned to leave, she called out, "Mother, I'm just remembering my bottom line. On the other hand, you should reflect on yourself. You've been too willful in many things." Chidian.com welcomes readers to visit and read our latest, fastest, and hottest serialized works on Chidian Originals. Chapter 44. The inn in Whiterun was crowded with people. In fact, as soon as he arrived at the city, he heard some bad news. The monsters in the nearby wilderness seemed to have gone mad. They were migrating en masse, and all the roads southeast of Whiterun were blocked by the monsters. All kinds of creatures living in the plains and hills had migrated to human areas, causing the fighting around Whiterun to escalate. Even the army station nearby had been dispatched to patrol outside the city. The Adventurers Guild even issued a B-rank investigation mission, offering 12,000 Kindler coins as a reward to hire people to find out the cause of the migration. There was no need to solve this problem. Just finding out the reason for the migration of so many creatures could get a reward of 12,000 gold dirals. Unfortunately, the results were not good. The first few groups of adventurers who set out could not even enter the Black Swamp. They were beaten back by a group of ogres. Adventurers who dared to accept a B-rank mission were not ordinary people. The whole group was made up of high-grade professions above grade 3, and there was even a native wizard among them. However, such a strong group of adventurers had to retreat with 2 dead and 3 injured. They encountered a group of ogres, but that was not the main problem. The challenge level of ogres was not high, but there was a 2-headed ogre among them. And it was a 2-headed ogre wizard. The ogre's multicasting skills killed the spellcasters in the adventurers group, and it commanded the ogres to surround them. In the end, only 3 of them managed to escape with some items. They also saw huge footprints on the way back. Some people suspected that the mountain giants in the southwest had been driven here by something. The other group of adventurers might have been wiped out. More than 100 caravans were blocked in Whiterun. Some of the more heavily armed caravans tried to pass through from another direction, but they encountered a large group of gnolls, 150 to 300 of them. Less than 1/10 of them survived. Now half of Whiterun's roads had been sealed off. Other than the road from where Soren came from, all roads leading to Autumnfall and the sea were occupied by all kinds of monsters. Goblins, kobolds, gnolls, ogres, lizardmen, etc. It was as if there was some terrifying existence that had chased out all the creatures in the southern region near the Damar Mountains. There were already rumors that a dragon had appeared there. It was a pity. No one had been able to bring back accurate information, and no one had actually seen the figure of the dragon. A muddy road. Soren held Vivian in his arms as they walked through the dirty streets. The traveling horses were left in the horse market. As there were too many caravans in Whiterun, all the hotels in the city were full. Even if they were to pay twice the price, it was still difficult to find a place to stay in the city. In this era, foreigners were often discriminated against. Soren had no choice but to bring Vivian to the old district, the slums. More and more caravans were stopped in Whiterun. Unless they were willing to return, they could only wait for the trade route to be reopened. This was bad news for Soren. This was because his original route had been cut off by these migrating monsters. If he was the only one taking the risk, it should be a relatively easy thing to do. However, if Vivian was involved, it would be very troublesome. Soren could not guarantee that he could take care of her in the event of a battle. An ancient red dragon. This was the first thought that popped into Soren's mind. Because the existence that could control so many monsters, except for adult dragons, Soren really couldn't think of anything else. Moreover, the center of the monster's expulsion was similar to the location where the ancient red dragon appeared in Soren's memory. Because the speed of information transmission in this world was relatively slow, if Whiterun slowly found someone to investigate the reason for the monster's outbreak, it would coincide with the time of the ancient red dragon's appearance. This dragon had been ravaging the south for more than 2 years, and countless people had died in its hands. It was also cunning enough to disguise itself as a normal red dragon. It was not until the players deduced that its level was much higher that everyone knew that it was an ancient red dragon with a challenge rating of 25. If it hadn't provoked a saint during the time of troubles, there wouldn't have been anyone in the entire southern region who could have killed it. Ancient red dragon, grade 7. Challenge rating, 25. Monster level, 34. Super dragon breath. Estimated attributes, strength 42, dexterity 10, constitution 35, intelligence 25, wisdom 24, charm 24. Special abilities, ancient dragon, legendary magic, giant creature, super dragon breath. Difficulty, S+. These were some of the attributes of the ancient red dragon in Soren's memory. Its challenge rating was the same as that of a lesser deity. The only difference was that it did not have a divinity or divinity. It only had the strength bonus of an ancient dragon. There was once a person who wanted to rely on human wave tactics to kill it, but in the end, dozens of people were killed by a single dragon wing strike, and hundreds of people were killed by a single dragon breath. This directly cut off the idea of relying on human wave tactics to kill it. Even so, there were still people who wanted to sneak in because all the wealth of the ancient red dragon was stored inside. There were more than 5 million Kindler, various rare items, and at least 10 legendary items. As for divine artifacts, they were rarely found in the outside world unless the deity who created them had fallen. Otherwise, even the ancient red dragon might not have the right to own them. Therefore, there was no way to confirm whether there were any divine artifacts in the dragon's den. The only thing that was certain was, there were indeed people who entered the dragon's den through harassment and obtained 1 or 2 legendary items. This was the key to successfully slaying a deity. Soren was only level 5 at the moment. Without the buff of fear resistance, he could not even stand in front of the ancient red dragon. Of course, he was not stupid enough to think of using the ancient red dragon, but the problem was that the monsters blocked the way and he could not bring Vivian to Autumnfall. The red dragon had been entrenched for a long time, which meant that the road would be blocked for a long time unless the others killed all the monsters that were forced to migrate. Otherwise, Soren could only rely on himself to cross the White Horse Plain. The inn was in a hubbub. Soren carried Vivian into the inn. There were adventurers with swords and knives everywhere, and there were also some small caravans. Those damn jackalans. A strong man slammed his wine glass on the table and said in a deep voice, "They ate Maya just like that. When I finally found his body, I couldn't even put his head and neck together." Almost all the adventurers were complaining. This sudden attack caught everyone off guard. Some of the villages that were built by humans near the Black Swamp had been forced to migrate. This was because the lizard men living in the swamp had begun to attack frequently. Some kind of terrifying existence forced them to leave the swamp, and they needed a new place to live, so the humans that originally lived nearby became their enemy. A drunken figure stumbled towards Soren. "I'm sorry." When he bumped into Soren, a hand nimbly reached for his money pouch. But before the hand could touch the pouch, Soren frowned and instantly grabbed the thief's wrist. Then he twisted his hand and flipped the thief to the ground. At the same time, he lifted his foot and stepped on the thief's knee, pressing him to the ground. The entire inn was silent in an instant. Only the thief's painful screams could be heard. Soren did not hold back and directly dislocated the thief's arm. "Keep your eyes open." Soren put Vivian down and pulled out his curved sword with his other hand. His expression was cold as he gestured at the thief's arm. Several people nearby put their hands on their waists. It was impossible to tell if they were the thief's accomplices, but they were all approaching Soren. Enough. A man sitting at the bar stood up. He frowned and looked at Soren, then pointed at the thief on the ground and said, "Break his arm and throw him out. How dare you steal from my inn? You're courting death." Crack. The people around the inn nodded at Soren, then grabbed the thief's arm and twisted it. The thief screamed in pain as two people picked him up and threw him into the smelly ditch outside the inn. They were the inn's hired thugs. It seemed that the inn's background was not very clean, but it was impossible to find an inn with a clean background in the old district. "Young man. Looks like you're quite skilled. Do you want to stay here?" The man in front of the bar looked at Soren deeply. When his eyes fell on Vivian, his eyes lit up and he said in a deep voice, "2 silver dirhams per night. If you're not satisfied, you can go out and find a place to stay." Soren looked around and threw 2 silver dirhams on the table. He then picked up Vivian. The man raised his head and gestured to the side, then swept the silver dirhams over. A waitress with heavy makeup came over and led Soren to the second floor of the inn. These were all part-time waitresses. They worked as waitresses in the inn and provided some special services to the guests who could afford to pay. Chidien.com welcomes readers to visit and read our latest, fastest and hottest serialized works on Chidien Originals. Chapter 45. In the corner of the inn. A fat man sitting in the shadows whispered a few words to a waiter. The waiter nodded and came to the bar. "Marauder wants to talk to you." The man in front of the bar frowned and nodded. "I'll be there in a moment." He waved his hand and arranged for one of his men to sit in front of the bar. Then he walked to the shadows and sat down. "Marauder, you old fox. Don't tell me you're interested in that girl?" The fat man poured himself a glass of wine and looked up at him. Although his face was full of fat, his movements were not as slow as his appearance suggested. "Kofan. That little girl just now was not bad. Many nobles like this kind of style recently. If you catch her, I'm sure I can sell her for this price." The fat marauder raised 5 fingers and said slowly, 500 Kindler coins. "I'm sure a lot of nobles with special interests would be willing to pay this price for a pretty girl like her." Kofan frowned. He looked at the fat man and said in a deep voice, "You know what? You're breaking my rules. I won't do this in my own inn." The fat man smiled and shrugged. He moved his head closer and said, "You've sold hundreds of women to me. Don't tell me your basement is clean. It's up to you whether you want to do this or not. I'm sure you can get rid of that girl quickly. A lot of nobles like her." Kofan seemed to hesitate. He lowered his voice and said, "That guy isn't easy to deal with. He seems to be a rogue. He's very vigilant. I can't let anyone die in my inn. Otherwise the security team will come after me." The fat man in the corner smiled strangely and said in a low voice, "We don't have to worry about anyone dying. We're just merchants, not killers, right? I have a potion I bought from a wizard. You just have to put it on a towel and cover your nose and mouth. It'll make you lose the ability to resist. When that guy leaves, you can arrange for someone to go in and take the girl away with a sack. He's just an outsider. He can't do anything here. If necessary, we can—" Marauder made a throat-slitting gesture and said in a low voice, 500 Kindler coins isn't a small sum. I knew you had plans to stop. After this, you can buy a small manor." Kofan was silent for a moment, then gritted his teeth and said, "Fine. But I need your men to do it. The price has to be raised to 600 Kindler. Based on my experience over the years, that little girl is definitely of the highest quality. When she grows up, she will definitely be a great beauty." Marauder hesitated for a moment before extending his hand. "You really are a greedy old dog. Deal. I'll give you the money after the goods are sold. Don't worry, such good goods are very popular with the nobles." Kofan stretched out his hand and said in a deep voice, "All right." The big man got up from the table and gave a look to the thug next to him. Then he entered the kitchen at the back. A tall and skinny man turned around and whispered to Marauder, "Boss, I'm not sure what to do next. Is it really worth it to make a move here for a little girl? The White-Run guards have been very strict recently. Besides, 600 Kindler coins is too high a price. From what I can see, she can't be worth more than 200 Kindler coins." "What do you know?" Marauder frowned and looked at him. "That little girl is a bit special. How could she be sold to those old dogs? I know some people who are willing to pay a high price for this kind of special goods." The tall, thin man shuddered when he heard this. Then he remembered some bad memories. Naturally, Not all of the women and children who were abducted from the slums of the old city were sold to the nobles of Whiterun or sold as slaves. There were other creatures who were willing to pay a high price for goods from them, especially pure virgins and those with special bloodlines. People who wandered in the gray area would always have dealings with the umbral realm. Some of the creatures hiding in the human society had always been the biggest customers of human trafficking. It was already an unspoken rule of the umbral realm to not attack ordinary people. Many special creatures had secretly made connections with human trafficking. As long as the transaction was completed, there would be no trouble. If the goods that were sold accidentally died, there would naturally be buyers who would take care of them. Marauder frowned and looked at the man next to him. How are you going to make a lot of money with me if you're so timid? We'll leave after this. The situation is getting more and more unstable. Do it when you have the chance. Second floor in a room. Soren put Vivian down and looked around the room. He took out some things from his multidimensional bag and squatted in front of Vivian. There are all kinds of people here. Be careful when I go out. Soren took out a dagger and handed it to the little girl. Do you still remember what I taught you? Vivian gently nodded her little head and reached out to take the dagger. She whispered, I remember. Don't worry, big brother. Soren hesitated for a moment, but he was still worried. Vivian was born with over 20 points of charisma, and people with high charisma tended to attract a lot of attention. It would be fine if she was an adult who could protect herself, but she was only an 8-year-old girl. It was too easy for people to covet her. This was especially true for human trafficking. Human trafficking in every city was an important source of income for the umbral realm. Nobles, prostitutes, black market slaves, and even vampires. As a rogue, Soren knew all too well what the umbral realm did, so he always tried to keep Vivian in his line of sight. He was very wary of this world. Perhaps it was because he had been exposed to too much of the dark side as a rogue. He always felt that the people he met were from the umbral realm. This was a very dark and chaotic era. The law was often just a decoration. What restricted people's behavior was more of a belief and morality. These two things were the most difficult to determine. Soren wanted to go to the Adventurers Guild to inquire about the news and see if he could find someone to go with him. He now had some kindler in his hands. He might need to go to some special places to meet some people and buy some prohibited weapons from them at a high price. The journey to Autumnfall was not peaceful. At this time, it was not convenient to bring Vivian with him, but Soren was not at ease if he did not bring her along. Big brother. Vivian reached out her small hand and held Soren's hand. As if she knew that he was a little worried, she whispered, When you go out, I'll stay in the room alone. I promise I won't run around. Soren hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, Okay. I'll go out and inquire about the situation and see if there's any other way to leave. You stay in the room and don't run around. I'll be back in half a day at most. I'll find a place to stay tomorrow. As Soren's figure left, the two people in the inn immediately looked at each other. The fat marauder winked at the thin man next to him and handed him a bottle of potion. Be quick. He whispered to the thin man, I'll go to the back and help you. Once you get it, go to the same place. I'll find a way to contact the buyer. Will Cowan be angry if we do it now? The thin man asked. Marauder glared at him and said in a low voice, That old dog is willing to sell his own sister for money. As long as we get the money, who cares? Inside the room, Vivian was playing with a dagger out of boredom. If Soren were here, he would definitely be surprised. The little girl was able to play with the dagger like a flower. It was exactly how he used to train his fingers when he was bored. I really want to grow up faster. The little girl tilted her head and spun the dagger in her hand. Because of her small hand, the difficulty was even higher than Soren's. Although she wasn't as fast as Soren, she didn't make any mistakes. If she made a mistake, she would cut her fingers. Clang, clang. Someone knocked on the door. The little girl stood up and hid the dagger behind her back. She shouted, Who is it? A waiter from the inn. A man's voice came from outside the door. The boss asked me to bring up the food. Food? The little girl was confused and muttered, They give out free food here? Most inns only provided accommodation. The food had to be bought from the bar in front. Vivian held the dagger in her small hand and opened the door with a frown. She looked outside. Sure enough, there was a tall and thin man carrying food. There was also a towel beside him. The little girl couldn't help but sigh in relief. She leaned to the side and hid the dagger. She said softly, Please put it on the table. The tall and thin man looked around the room and couldn't help but smile. He quickly entered the room and closed the door. Then he picked up the towel beside him and rushed towards Vivian. In an instant, the little girl bent over to dodge. Just as the tall and thin man rushed in and closed the door, she felt that something was wrong. When the tall and thin man picked up the towel to cover her mouth and nose, Vivian instantly took out the dagger. She raised a finger and uttered a strange syllable. Then a strong light exploded in the room. Blood splattered everywhere. The tall and thin man in front of her lost his target. When he bent over, the little girl waved the dagger and slashed his right eye. One of his eyes was destroyed on the spot. There was a suppressed scream. The tall and thin man covered his eye with his hand and suddenly grabbed at the little girl. Although Vivian had already dodged, she was too small and too slow. After using all her strength to swing the dagger, she couldn't dodge in time. Lightning shock. The tall and thin man who had already grabbed the little girl and was about to choke her suddenly trembled. An arc of electricity jumped on Vivian's fingertips. The tall and thin man's whole body twitched as if he had epilepsy. His grip on the little girl's arm loosened weakly. There was a flash of cold light. Vivian instantly used the dagger to stab the tall and thin man's left eye. The tall and thin man's whole body stiffened and then he became motionless. The little girl's face showed a trace of horror. She looked at the blood on her hand and the dagger fell to the ground. But she quickly took a deep breath and then reached out to pick up the dagger. She quietly glanced outside. After making sure that no one else was disturbed, she immediately picked up the things and ran out of the room. In front of the hotel lobby, the little girl suddenly stopped. Then she turned around and slipped into the backyard. She went out through a small dog hole. Ignoring the mud all over her body, Vivian got out of the dog hole and sprinted outside. Chapter 46. The Adventurers Guild. When Soren entered, the guild was already bustling with activity. Many merchants had gathered here, and they were planning to gather their reputations and work together to break through the encirclement. If the road continued to be blocked, the goods in their hands would rot here, and some of the goods would be lost if they missed the deadline. If the road was blocked for a month or two, they might not even be able to return to their homes. Many places would be covered in snow during winter, and it would be impossible to cross the encirclement. The roads in this world were still primitive. Even if there were human activities, they would still be blocked by the snow and ice of winter. In his previous life, snowstorms were rare due to global warming, but in this primitive world, winter was the time when human activity was rare. Even in the south, the snow could reach up to 20 centimeters thick. With such a thickness, a person's foot would reach their knees, and it would be impossible for carriages and horses to pass through. Knowledge geography. The B-rank quest reward was still on the bulletin board. Although Soren wanted to accept the quest and tell them the reason behind it, he knew that he was not strong enough to take the reward. Leaving aside the question of how he could prove that he knew there was an ancient red dragon in the encirclement. Even if they believed him, the suspicion they would have was enough to cause unnecessary trouble. The Adventurers Guild would not easily believe that a mere Tier 2 rogue could obtain such important information. With his strength, he could not even break through the encirclement of monsters outside the encirclement. This kind of quest required a rough record of the completion of the quest. Soren did not even know the geography of the encirclement, so how could he make up a flawless lie? The merchants were still arguing. They wanted to work together to hire more manpower, but they also wanted to ask the higher-ranked merchants to send an army to Whiterun to clear the encirclement. The monsters that were expelled from their original encirclement had taken over many places, cutting off the trade routes and cutting off the supplies to Whiterun. Incompetent nobles. Soren turned around and glanced at the young merchant who was complaining. He then walked out of the guild. For now, these people could not come up with a viable solution. Now it was up to Whiterun to deal with the situation. In every city there were places that could not see the light of day. These places had inconspicuous signs, and if one was not familiar with the gray area, it would be difficult to find the dark corners of these alleys. Soren walked through the dirty alleys, and the air was filled with the smell of urine. Even a place like Whiterun could not avoid the filth and stench. Many residents poured their chamber pots out of their windows onto the streets. In other words, if one was not careful early in the morning, they would be drenched in urine. Soon, Soren arrived in front of an iron gate. There was a cross of swords in front of the gate, and a snake was engraved underneath. Click. He knocked on the door and the door frame opened. The guard looked at him coldly and asked in a deep voice, "Who is it?" "Is everywhere." Soren rin as the heavy door opened quickly. The guard glanced behind him and invited him in. The space inside was very spacious and there were a lot of weapons. However, most of them were ordinary equipment including prohibited crossbows. Many of the lethal items were prohibited items and military weapons. They could not be bought from regular weapon shops. Soren wanted to buy more than these, so he had to go through the gray area. "What do you want?" A man with a cold expression walked out. Soren looked at him, then looked around and said, "Venom. The venom of a wyvern. And a crossbow. The bolts must be poisoned as well." The man stared at him, then turned around and sat on a chair. He crossed his legs and said, "These things are not cheap. Did you bring enough money?" Soren took out a heavy money bag and said, 120 Kindler coins. "I want undiluted venom. Don't try to fool me with defective products." This was a lesson learned from experience. He had bought many diluted venoms in the past. "Deal." The gloomy man pondered for a moment, then opened the drawer and took out a thumb-sized bottle. He threw it directly into Soren's hand and said in a deep voice, "If you're not afraid of death, check it yourself." Soren caught it, uncorked it and smelled it. He then quickly closed it and threw the money bag in his hand over. The venom of the wyvern. It was the strongest poison that could be obtained through conventional means. It was also the most commonly used poison by assassins. Poison was not as simple as rubbing it on. Many poisons would quickly evaporate after coming into contact with air. Wyvern venom was one of the most stable. It could maintain its toxicity for a day or two when rubbed on a weapon. To deal with more troublesome enemies, thieves had to rely on other means. "Follow me." The man took the money bag and counted it. He then gave a look and said, "The weapon you want is behind." The man quickly took out a strong crossbow. There were also 30 dark green bolts. These bolts were soaked in venom when they were made. The poison had already seeped into them. They were more deadly to ordinary people, but they could also deal a lot of damage to professions. Regular weapons shops could only buy ordinary equipment. This kind of thing could not be obtained through conventional means. 30 Kindler. The man threw the crossbow over to check the goods and said, "Is there anything else you need? There are still many good things in my shop." Soren took the crossbow and assembled it. He then put it away and said, "Do you have any alchemy products?" The man's expression stiffened. He paused for a moment and said, "Those things will cause trouble if they get out. The city guards will conduct a large-scale search without waiting for the church to make a move." The control of alchemy weapons was very strict. Soren was not surprised. He paid for the crossbow and said, "I'll take these." When Soren left, the guard on the side glanced at him and came over to say, "Boss, I'm sorry. What's the background of that guy?" "We're just doing business. I don't care where he's from." The man played with a kindler in his hand and said in a deep voice, "Maybe he's from the Mask of Shadows or maybe he's from the Dark Brotherhood. None of those rogues know their place." After buying what he wanted, Soren rushed to the inn. But before he got close, he felt that something was wrong. There were a lot of Whiterun city guards nearby. He covered his weapon with his clothes and quickly ran to the inn where he was staying. There were a lot of people around him and some of them looked unfriendly. Something happened. Soren's face instantly turned ugly. He put his hand on his curved sword and released a murderous aura. But someone suddenly pulled him back. The person looked familiar. He should be one of the guards. He came over to Soren and hurriedly said, "Vivian is fine. The little girl is very smart. She came to us after the incident. She's now at the caravan's residence. The master sent me to find you." Soren breathed a sigh of relief. He looked around with some lingering fear, frowned, and stared at the inn owner who was explaining to the Whiterun guards in the distance. He then turned around and left with the caravan guard. He would deal with this matter when he came back. The most important thing now was to make sure Vivian was safe. Soren walked very fast. The caravan guard had no choice but to trot to keep up. The two soon arrived at the caravan station in Whiterun City. Because the northern witches were quite powerful, they had their own independent courtyard and shops close to the bustling area. The guard captain nodded when he saw Soren. The two had become closer after selling the Ankheg shells. If Soren was not in a hurry to leave, the guard captain would have invited Soren for a drink. After all, the 1,500 Kindler made them a lot of money. "The master is inside." The guard captain pointed at the room behind him and said, "The little girl is very smart. She couldn't find you after the incident at the inn, so she followed the original path to find us. I didn't expect an 8-year-old girl to have such a good memory. I've been here a few times but sometimes I don't know the way. She's in the master's room. We can't go in. Be careful. The master doesn't seem to be in a good mood today." Soren nodded to express his gratitude. He then took a deep breath, opened the door and walked in. "Big brother." Vivian, who was sitting on a chair, saw Soren and immediately ran to him. Soren reached out and hugged her. He patted her back gently and said, "It's okay. I'm back. Tell me what happened." The little girl had changed into a clean set of clothes. The white dress on her made her look like a little princess. The mysterious mistress of the caravan was sitting on a deck chair in the room. When she saw Soren, she frowned and said, "Vivian knows magic. Why didn't you tell me? Do you know how many problems a natural warlock will encounter? They're different from the rest, and they're destined to attract a lot of trouble before they grow up. If it's someone with good intentions, it's fine. But if it's someone with evil intentions, Vivian will become their easy target." Soren was stunned. Although the mistress of the caravan spoke in a harsh tone, her words still surprised Soren. Her attitude told him that she cared about Vivian's safety. They had known each other for less than 5 days, and they had only traveled together. They didn't really talk much. The mistress of the caravan's reaction could only mean that she really liked Vivian, or that she was so good at acting that she could even fool herself. The little girl seemed to be able to get close to others easily, as long as they didn't have any bad intentions. For example, the priestess and the northern witch in front of him. "I'm sorry." Soren didn't know why he was apologizing, but he still put Vivian down and bowed. "We didn't want to attract unnecessary trouble, so we didn't tell you that Vivian can cast spells. After all, we can't be sure who's trustworthy. I owe you one this time." Warlock, profession information. Warlocks are born with the ability to cast spells. They begin to display their primitive magic during puberty. Their first spells may be cast accidentally, and they may not be able to control them. Sometimes, it can even lead to dangerous situations. A young warlock's house is often filled with strange sounds and lights, and it looks like a haunted place. However, one day the warlock will understand their own unique power and begin to practice and improve their spellcasting skills. A few lucky young warlocks can be taught by older warlocks how to use their innate power. However, it's more common for young warlocks to live a lonely life due to fear from their friends and misunderstandings from their family. Because of their natural charm, warlocks often leave a strong impression on others, which helps them to communicate with others. But sometimes, because of her appearance, she would attract unnecessary trouble. Female sorcerer. Before they grow up, warlocks will encounter many problems due to their unique characteristics. Chapter 47. The mistress's expression softened a little. She waved at Vivian, and the little girl walked over obediently. It seemed that she was much closer to Vivian because of her help this time. "Go to the main hall first." The mistress patted Vivian's head and said softly, "I have something to talk to your brother about." Vivian turned around and looked at Soren. She only left after he nodded at her. "Soren." The mistress watched as Vivian left. After she left, she said in a serious tone, "I want to know about your past. Did anything special happen?" Vivian's talent is extraordinary. She awakened her magic at such a young age. Her future achievements are immeasurable. Sauron looked at her, shook his head gently and said slowly, "I'm sorry. There's nothing special that I need to tell you. Vivian and I were orphans when we were young. Our lives were no different from those of the poor." "Orphans?" The mistress's expression softened a little. "There's no way that nothing happened. When a sorcerer awakens their magic for the first time, they usually go through a lot of emotional turmoil. Something special must have happened to awaken Vivian's power." Solon was a little stunned when he heard this and then asked, "Something special?" "I once met a sorcerer during a mission. I was severely injured and was bedridden for half a month. Maybe I'm not fated to die yet." The mistress looked at him and muttered to herself, "Is that so? She cares a lot about you. If you are seriously injured and your life is in danger, it is very likely that she will awaken her hidden power. Vivian is still too young. As she gradually grows up, her power will become stronger and stronger. If she doesn't know how to control this power, it is very likely that she will harm others or even cause great destruction. You're not a sorcerer, so you can't understand her talent. She's a spellcasting genius. Even my mother isn't as talented as her." "Spellcasting genius?" When Soren heard these words, he suddenly trembled and thought to himself, could it be that Vivian has the talent of spellcasting genius? It was the most powerful talent that spellcasters could have. If Soren remembered correctly, anyone with the spellcasting genius ability could get A+2 spellcasting power bonus for any spell, and at the same time the casting time of any spell could be shortened by 1 second. That was to say, any spell that took less than 1 second to cast could be instantly cast by people with this ability. Even a level 0 spell has a casting time of more than 1 second. Soren seemed to have thought of something, and some images flashed through his mind. But Vivian seems to have activated it after chanting the spell. It seems like the spell is really instantaneous. A level 0 spell's incantation was very short. It only had 1 or 2 syllables and it took less than 1 second to finish chanting. If one didn't have a special spellcasting talent, they would need to gather elemental energy. Soren didn't know much about spells, so he couldn't tell if the spell was instantaneous or not. However, the northern witch in front of him could definitely tell. In other words, the spellcasting genius Vivian might really have a talent called spellcasting genius. This talent was a special ability that couldn't be mastered through training. Spellcasters of any profession could increase their spellcasting power by 1 point per profession level. With 10 points as the standard, every 2 points in the main attribute would increase their spellcasting power by 1 point. In other words, if a level 5 sorcerer had 16 points of intelligence, the spellcasting power would be increased by 5 plus 16 to 10, 2 is equal to 8. The so-called spellcasting power was actually a measurement passed down from the arcane era. For example, the level 0 spell Lightning Shock could only produce 3 points of electric energy. However, if the level 5 sorcerer above cast it, the power of the electric arc could reach 11 points. If this power of electric arc was used on an ordinary person, it would be fatal because ordinary people only had around 10 points of HP. However, if it was used on a profession, it would inevitably be resisted by the vitality of the profession, and the damage would only be around 5 to 8 points. In addition to the strong vitality of professions, it would only cause light electric shock damage. It was like an ordinary person touching a high-voltage electric current. The following was Vivian's ability. If she really had a talent called spellcasting genius, then when she cast the level 0 spell Lightning Shock, the power of the gathered lightning would be increased by 1 plus 2 plus 21 to 10, 2 is equal to 8, 5. The power of the spell would be a little stronger than a level 5 sorcerer, and this was only because she was only a level 1 sorcerer. As her profession level increased in the future, this difference would become bigger and bigger, especially after she learned spells like Finger of Death, that directly relied on the opponent's vitality to determine whether or not it would directly kill. Many sorcerers' spells did not directly cause damage, such as Web, Charm Person, Control, and so on. The success of these spells depended on the sorcerer's spellcasting power and the will of the target. Under normal circumstances, a legendary sorcerer's spellcasting power would only be around 30 points. 20 points of profession level would give the spellcasting power, 8 points of intelligence would give the spellcasting power, and some special talents would give the spellcasting power. If there was a legendary equipment, the spellcasting power could be increased by 1 to 3 points. This was why the spellcasting genius ability surprised Soren so much. Not to mention, if Vivian mastered the spellcasting proficiency ability in the future, she would be able to increase her spellcasting time by another second. At that time, she would be able to cast any spell that took less than 2 seconds. There was a brief moment of silence. The mistress glanced at Soren and continued, "Before you came, I performed a divination ritual for Vivian, and I saw something bad." Divination? Was it a branch of prophecy? It seemed to be an ability of the northern witches, and it was said that they could vaguely predict a person's future. However, it was impossible to say exactly how clear the prophecy was because even a legendary level prophecy could only see a fragment of the future. It was a very short scene, and the moment the prophecy was completed, it would start to deviate. The further the time period was, the greater the deviation of the prophecy. Prophecy spells were mainly used to predict the future, allowing the caster to avoid dangerous situations or places in advance. This was the reason why the northern witch suddenly left Amber City in advance. When she performed the divination, she sensed that something dangerous was about to happen in Amber City, and it was something that she could not change even with her current power. Soren took a deep breath and slowly asked, "What did you see?" "Blood and fire," the mistress said solemnly. She took a deep look at Soren and said with a serious expression, "Prophecies can only predict the future from fragments and images. Blood represents slaughter and death, which means that Vivian will be surrounded by death in the future. Fire represents war and destruction, which means that she will experience many destructive things in the future. I don't know what's so special about her, but the trajectory of fate has already determined that she will not be an ordinary person in the future." According to the Northern Witch's divination, only a small number of people would see such a scene. Some of them would become kings, some would become evil tyrants, and some would become legends. Regardless of whether they were evil or righteous, their lives would be filled with slaughter and death. The mistress took a deep breath and said slowly, Vivian's future is destined to be turbulent, and you won't be able to protect her forever. Forgive me for being blunt, but you seem to be afraid of something. I don't know what you're afraid of, but I can feel that you're running away from any possible danger. That includes me. Maybe that's why you can't trust me. Silence. Soren fell silent. Afraid? Maybe I'm really afraid. It's because I care so much about her that I'm afraid of losing her. Running away? Am I really running away? Soren knew all too well how many terrible things would happen in the upcoming year of troubles. The gods and demons tore apart the sky and the earth. In this unprecedented catastrophe, even legendary professions could be wiped out like chickens and dogs. He was only a Tier 2 rogue. Shouldn't he be running away from all of this? It was a war between gods. Even a legendary-level professional only had the qualification to enter the arena. There were as many saints as dogs, and liches were everywhere. He didn't even have the right to fight with them. Was he supposed to just sit there and wait for destruction to come? He wouldn't even know where his enemy was when death came. What if he hadn't left? Would they have been wiped out like ants by the meteor burst that destroyed Amber City? The woman in front of him didn't know. She didn't know what was about to happen or what kind of terrible disaster it would cause. This was because even legendary witches could not foresee the coming age of turmoil. Mortals were powerless in front of gods. Millions of players couldn't stop the year of troubles, so how could he change it all by himself? What else could he do other than run away and wait for the right time to accumulate strength? Yes. Soren slowly raised his head and looked at the mistress in front of him. I'm afraid and running away from some things. Some things can't be changed by human strength. I don't trust you either. You seem to like Vivian a lot, but you're acting all high and mighty. I may be weak now, but I won't be weak forever. I know what you're trying to say. I'll never let Vivian leave my side. I'll protect her with my life, but you can't. You care more about Vivian's talent. If she doesn't have it, she'll just be an ordinary girl to you. But it's different for me. Whether or not Vivian has talent, she's the closest person to me. She's the only family I have left in this world. You said that I still can't trust you. Yes. Because you haven't even told me your name. Maybe you don't think I deserve to know your name, and you only want to keep her by your side because you're curious. I'm very grateful to you for bringing us all the way to Whiterun, and I'm even more grateful for your help today. I'll find a way to repay you in the future. You're a kind and benevolent witch. Otherwise, you wouldn't have needed to say so much to me. A simple charm spell would have been enough to solve the problem. I'm very grateful to you. Soren bowed deeply and walked out the door. Wait. The mistress stood up and stared at Soren. She sighed when she saw the determination in his eyes. She knew that there were some things that the man in front of her would protect with his life. This was the reason why she noticed Vivian's talent in the first place. It was a sincere and distant feeling. She slowly walked in front of Soren. She looked at the weak but determined man in front of her. For the first time in her life, she felt that he was qualified to speak to her as an equal. It wasn't because of his strength, but because he cared so much about the little girl. The mistress of the caravan sighed. Magic can't solve all problems. Overusing your power will only make you lose your way. My name is Gloria. Maybe you can let her stay by my side for a while and learn some useful magic knowledge. It'll be helpful for her in the future. She reached out her hand. For the first time, the mistress spoke to him as an equal. Her name was Gloria. She was a powerful northern witch. The man in front of her, who she could easily kill, had won her respect with his firm beliefs and sincere feelings. Chapter 48. Evening. Soren left the caravan alone. Gloria was right. He did not have the ability to guide Vivian's path. Unless he planned to become a wizard, Vivian would have to learn all the spells on her own. She would have to take a lot of detours, and sometimes it could even cause destruction and danger. To some extent, this was what a talented sorcerer had to face. Therefore, Soren decided to let Vivian stay by his side for a while. He would not let Gloria take Vivian away, but since they were trapped in Whiterun, it would be better for Vivian to stay by his side for the time being. Moreover, Soren was ready to take this opportunity to go out and take a risk. When he walked out of the room, the little girl's eyes were red. Perhaps she had eavesdropped on their conversation, but she reached out her small hands and tightly grabbed onto Soren's clothes. Her pitiful appearance made Soren's heart ache, but it also made him more determined to go out and take a risk. Time waits for no man. If he slowly leveled up like before, it would be very difficult for him to protect himself before the time of troubles. Therefore, Soren had to go out and take a risk because there was a chance in front of him. Although the ancient red dragon had not yet appeared, the chain reaction caused by its appearance had already begun to ferment. In the past he would still have to search for monsters in the wild, but now, all the monsters around the Black Swamp had been driven out by the dragon's aura. In other words, Soren did not need to go deep into the wilderness. He could encounter a lot of monsters in just a few days. If he was lucky and didn't encounter anything dangerous, he could even get close to 1,000 slaughter EXP a day by hunting monsters. It would take at least a week for the trade route to Whiterun to open. As long as Soren was not unlucky enough to die in the hands of monsters, he could level up to grade 3 in a week's time. Food, weapons, bandages, potions, insect repellent, antidotes. Soren's figure was busy in the trading area. After such a long time, his savings were quickly spent until there was no more space in the multidimensional bag. Only then did he stop his crazy purchases. The night was hazy. Soren's silhouette reappeared near the inn. He already knew what had happened from Vivian. Naturally, he wouldn't let them go so easily. Since they dared to do certain things, they had to pay the price. In a dark alley. The security in Whiterun had been getting worse and worse recently, and the number of guards patrolling the streets had increased by a lot. At the same time, someone had proposed to impose a curfew, but it had not been approved yet. The hotel seemed a little deserted. Because a person had died during the day, most of the guests had checked out. There was a lamp on the bar in front. The innkeeper, Cowan, sat at the front with a gloomy face. He looked at the fat man in front of him and said, "Marauder, is that all you've got?" He actually sent a subordinate who can't even handle an 8-year-old girl. "Are you out of your mind?" Marauder's expression froze. "How is that possible?" He growled. Lasker's skills are not inferior to those guards. How could he not even be able to handle a little girl? There's something fishy about this. Maybe someone else did it secretly. Not only did they steal our business, but they also killed my subordinate. In fact, he had another guess in his mind. That was, his subordinate had really failed. Not only did he fail to kidnap the little girl, but he was also killed by her. But this kind of thing was too absurd. How could a little girl who looked at most 7 or 8 years old kill a man who had undergone specialized combat training and was an advanced class holder? Suddenly there was a slight noise. Marauder raised his head cautiously and signaled to the thugs beside him. As a human trafficker who lived in the slums, his alertness had always been very high. "Boss, not good. The warehouse is on fire." One of his subordinates quickly ran over. The back of the hotel had caught on fire at some point. The fire spread quickly and almost reached the kitchen at the back. Cowan, who was in front of the counter, stood up angrily and yelled at his subordinate, "Bastard! Hurry up and put out the fire." The dozen or so people in the inn started to get busy. This kind of inn had its own well and water tank. The others quickly took out things to put out the fire. However, Marauder, who was sitting in front of the counter, had a slight change in his expression. He quietly looked around, and his fat body immediately ran away at a speed that did not match his size. Based on his intuition, he felt that the fire was too sudden. Maybe someone was planning to attack them. Moreover, the young man who went out during the day had not returned. Maybe he was the one who started the fire. The fat figure quietly slipped out of the side door. Marauder put his hand on the hilt of his sword and looked around vigilantly. Then he ran towards the street outside. Swoosh! A crossbow bolt shot out from the darkness. Marauder's fat body trembled, and he let out a painful cry. Rumble. There was a loud explosion in the distance. The wine barrels in the inn's warehouse were set on fire. Explosions occurred one after another. The sound of the explosion spread quickly and alerted the nearby patrolling guards. Swoosh! A second crossbow bolt shot out from above. Marauder was already on guard, so the bolt only grazed the side of his face. It was only then that he realized that the enemy was on the roof of a building beside the street. The explosion just now covered his scream. After realizing that the enemy had a crossbow, Marauder immediately rolled down the building and pulled out his weapon. The speed of a crossbow bolt was very slow, but the interval between the two bolts was less than 2 seconds. This meant that the enemy was an experienced crossbow user. He did not have any armor on him, so there was no way he could block the bolt with his body. Marauder opened his mouth to call for help, but gradually, a numbing sensation spread from his wound to his entire body. His body became stiffer and stiffer, and in the end he fell to the ground. Poison. The venom of a wyvern. Marauder's years of experience in the Grey Realm made him realize something. Despair immediately appeared on his face. A black shadow jumped down from the second floor. A cold light flashed. A scimitar sliced through his neck and decapitated him on the spot. Soren's masked figure appeared. He coldly looked at the corpse in front of him, bent his body and jumped up from the wall to the second floor. The Whiterun guards would arrive in 10 minutes at most, and he had to kill all of them within 5 minutes to escape. Since the fire was already spreading, there was a possibility that the wizards and priests would be alerted. In this era, most houses were made of wood. Once a fire started, it would be difficult to extinguish it with water. Sometimes it would even burn down an entire street. A row of data appeared in front of Soren's eyes. Target eliminated. Extracting soul energy from target. Received 180 slaughter EXP. Under the shadow of the night, a vigorous figure leaped across the rooftops. Soren quickly approached the inn and reloaded his crossbow. He only had a few seconds to shoot. In other words, he had to kill as many enemies as possible before the others heard the screams and reacted to the situation. Because even under the cover of the night, these experienced gang members could still react to the fact that someone was attacking them with a long-range weapon in a few seconds. Once they hid behind an object, half of the crossbow in Soren's hands would be useless. The arrows were all coated with venom beforehand. Soren crawled on the rooftops. The fire lit up the surroundings, but no one noticed him. Many of the residents living nearby were also alerted. Some of them had already put on their clothes and started helping to put out the fire. It was not because the inn owner was a popular person, but because their house would be destroyed if the fire started. Soren quickly identified his target. It was a tall man. He could not see him clearly due to the distance and the fire, but judging from the way he was yelling, he should be the inn owner during the day. Swoosh. A crossbow bolt was fired. The inn owner instantly let out a scream and hid behind a wooden plank. The man reacted quickly. It seemed like he had experienced many battles. After being attacked, he immediately shouted at his subordinates and used a wooden bucket to block in front of him. Soren did not have a crossbow specialization. It was not difficult for him to hit the target, but it was not easy to hit the vital points. However, it did not matter. The venom on the arrow would take effect in a short period of time. Even if the venom was not fatal, the paralyzing effect of the wyvern's venom would be enough to cripple the enemy. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 3 arrows were fired consecutively from the darkness. Soren did not care about aiming. He quickly reloaded his crossbow and fired at the direction of the people. 1 arrow hit the wooden door and the other 2 hit the enemy. However, none of them hit the vital points. Clang. Soren pulled out his curved sword from his back. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He jumped down from the rooftop, rolled to reduce the force, and pounced on the inn owner who was hiding behind the wooden door. Die. The curved sword drew an elegant arc. Soren cut through the opponent's waist and instantly cut open his stomach. Large pieces of intestines were exposed. He instantly withdrew his sword and stabbed forward, piercing the opponent's heart from the chest. The wyvern's venom would take effect in 2 minutes. The strong toxicity would spread through the blood. At first, it would only numb the victim, but soon the victim would lose all feeling in the wound. In the end, the victim's reaction speed would drastically decrease. This was the best venom that could be bought in the early stages of the game. It was also a must-have item for thieves to challenge boss-level enemies. A thumb-sized bottle would cost around 120 Kindler coins. It was equivalent to a rare-grade weapon. There was no time to clean up the battlefield. Soren quickly got up and rushed out, pouncing on another enemy who was hit by the arrow. The paralyzing effect would not last for long. The antibodies of the humans in this world were very good. As long as the victim did not die from the poison, they would gradually recover. The paralyzing effect of the wyvern's venom would last for 5 to 10 minutes. As long as the victim's constitution was not too high, such as 18 or even 20 points, it would be very difficult for them to be immune to the paralyzing effect. At most, it would shorten the duration of the paralyzing effect. The Whiterun city guards shouted from afar. The battle had alarmed many people, and the screams scared the nearby residents away. Soren glared at the other thugs who were hiding. He swung his curved sword and slit the throat of one of the thugs. Then he ducked down and rushed into the night. He could not let the Whiterun city guards discover him. For now he could only let the thugs escape. Fortunately, he had killed the one who seemed to be the leader of the group. The fire was getting bigger and bigger. Soon after the Whiterun city guards arrived, several wizards in gray robes appeared. They frowned as they looked at the bloodstains and corpses on the ground. Then they began to cast spells to extinguish the fire. Compared to the murder in front of them, controlling the spread of the fire was the most important thing. Chapter 49. There was a shadow cast by the corner of the city wall. Soren's body was hidden in the shadows. He calmly put away his crossbow and wiped the blood off his curved sword with an old cloth. He had killed 6 people. It seemed that these were all veterans of the gangs in the old city. Each of them gave him more than 100 slaughter EXP, especially the innkeeper who gave him more than 300 slaughter EXP. Unfortunately, due to the lack of time, he did not have the chance to loot the corpses or loot. He could only retreat after killing the enemies. It seemed that the Whiterun guards had taken advantage of all the loot, as they would have looted the corpses. Killing people was not a big deal. But arson was a big deal. The city of Whiterun did not care about the deaths of a few gray people, but they were very strict when it came to those who dared to set fire in the city. This was because once the fire spread, the consequences would be severe. The casualties and property losses would be much more serious than the deaths of a few gangsters. Soren estimated that someone would investigate this matter before tomorrow. If the city guards took this matter seriously, they would most likely hire someone special to investigate it. Then it would not be impossible for them to find out about Soren's identity. He had to leave now. Soren looked at the chaotic scene in the distance and walked along the shadow of the city wall until there was no light nearby. When he could no longer see the guards, he stopped and leaned against the wall. He took out a rope from his multidimensional bag and tied an iron hook to it. He spun the rope a few times in his hand and threw the hook into the recess of the city wall. He tightened the rope to test it, then started climbing up the wall. His 20 dexterity made him very agile. In less than a minute, he had climbed up the wall more than 20 meters high. He glanced around warily. After confirming that there was no one around, he fixed the hook in place and slid down the wall using the rope. Soren grabbed the rope and swung it hard. The hook loosened and fell back into his hand. It was dark in the wild, but the unique night vision ability of the half-elves allowed Soren to still see things. He put the things back into the multidimensional bag, then bent down and went into the woods in the distance. This time it wasn't as simple as just killing those guys. Soren planned to travel along the road from Whiterun to Autumnfall. On the one hand, he wanted to accumulate slaughter EXP and level up his class when necessary. On the other hand, he wanted to find an opportunity to advance his class. On the other hand, he wanted to check out the situation along the path and figure out the distribution of monsters nearby. That way he would have more confidence when he led Vivian through this path in the future. At the very least, Soren would never get the terrain and direction wrong after walking through it once. The city was surrounded by villages. Due to their proximity to the city, none of the villages were fenced. Whiterun's guards patrolled the area regularly, and if there were any monsters or beasts nearby, they would be taken care of. Soren walked for a few kilometers in the night and entered a small village. Nowadays there were many piles of straw near the village, mainly for the convenience of making a fire and making beds. The poor people didn't have the money to buy cotton quilts, so they could only use the straw to make their beds. In the winter they would even use it as a quilt. Kong beds were relatively rare in the south and they were more common in the north. Soren lay down on a pile of straw. At first it was a little itchy, but he soon got used to it. He had been adventuring in the wilderness for many years, so he had adapted to many things. The night passed just like that. The next day, Soren was woken up by the sound of a dog barking. He didn't know who'd found him, but it was barking under the straw pile. He pulled out his curved sword and circled around, planning to kill it, but when he saw the thatched house in the distance, he put away his weapon. For these poor farmers, a dog was a very important asset. Dogs in this era were fiercer. Sometimes they would even pounce on monsters and bite them a few times. Soren had seen a dog fight a gnoll. Although it was bitten to death in order to protect its master, its courage was admirable. Perhaps it was because he remembered Heath, that brave and loyal old dog. Soren took out a piece of jerky and tossed it to the dog. The sudden food lowered the dog's guard. It looked at Soren suspiciously, but in the end, it couldn't help but bite on the jerky. Soren patted the straw off his body and jumped down from the pile of straw. He looked around, then walked toward the wilderness in the distance. The sky was just beginning to brighten. There were already farmers working in the fields. As humans, they didn't have as many talents as other races, so they had to master the skill of farming. The children in the village would start working in the fields when they were 5 or 6 years old. Gradually, they would learn from their parents how to farm, when to sow, when to harvest, how to take care of the fields, and what to do in case of pests. They were the most ordinary group of people in the world. The roads in the fields were muddy. Soren quickly found the main road to Autumnfall and headed toward the Whiterun Plains. This road took a long time, taking a whole week. First, he had to pass through the Black Swamp, then through the edge of the Whiterun Plains and finally arrived at Autumnfall. The first day was relatively peaceful because it was still an area of human activity. There were militia groups stationed nearby, and a small number of regular troops. Soren didn't stop along the way. When he was tired, he would rest for a while, and when he felt better, he would continue on his way. It wasn't until the second day that he gradually walked out of the area of human activity that he encountered more and more things. The villages here were scattered. Only near the flat land that was convenient for irrigation, there were villages built by humans. However, they were more like villages. They were surrounded by walls on all sides, and there were watchtowers and arrow towers on top. The villages trained their own militia. When the farm was busy, they worked, and when the farm was idle, they would conduct simple training. There were always some young people in these villages who were unwilling to be lonely and longed for adventure. Some went out and never came back, and some returned to their hometown after giving up adventure. They were the main force in training the militia. Some of these people's profession levels were very high, but most of them were around grade 2 adventurers, and many of them were injured. If there were no accidents, they would get married and have children. When they were old, they would drink at dusk and boast about their adventures with their children and grandchildren. This was their life. After the excitement of the past, they would return to normal, and occasionally they would remember their comrades who had passed away. Kobold? Soren pulled out the grass and looked at the footprints on the ground. He then pressed his hand on his curved sword and continued to follow the footprints. Tracking in the wild was a skill that adventurers had to master. The best of them were undoubtedly the rangers and droll, followed by rogues like Soren. They needed to learn how to determine the target through the footprints and tracks. This ability was derived from the basic skill of survival in the wild. Soren was now relying on his past experience to determine the target. Looks like there are quite a few of them. As the ground in front of him hardened, the footprints became fainter. Soren looked around and said to himself, "I'm afraid there are 30 to 40 kobolds. Is there a relatively large group nearby? If there were no kobold settlements, these creatures would only be in small groups. They were like the hyenas of the plains of Africa. Small groups of kobolds would be stronger individually because survival in the wilderness was survival of the fittest. Large groups of kobolds would have more numbers, especially those that occupied mines. There might be more than 300 kobolds in total. On the basis of large numbers, there might be natural warlocks among the kobolds. Let's practice on them first and see if my past experience in group battles is still there. Adventurers in the wild naturally wouldn't be stupid enough to fight one-on-one with you. Group battles and chaotic battles were very common. You had to learn how to deal with multiple enemies at the same time. If you couldn't dodge or parry their attacks, you had to learn how to minimize the damage. In a chaotic battle, even with 20 points of dexterity, it was impossible to dodge all the attacks. In such a situation, you had to have a piece of armor. Soren put on an ordinary leather armor and wrapped his arms with a piece of cloth. At the same time, he tied up his legs. Kobolds knew how to use weapons and traps. Of course, those simple traps couldn't hurt Soren, but their self-made short bows were dangerous. Kobolds knew how to use clubs, daggers, short swords, and short bows. Soren's figure gradually faded under the shadows of the trees. If one didn't look carefully, it would be hard to notice him. He pulled out his curved sword and went deeper into the forest. This battle was more dangerous than the previous ones, because he had to face a group of more than 30 kobolds. Chapter 50. The light became dimmer and dimmer. Soren gradually entered the dense forest. He could hear the cries of various animals. There was even a small elk. It looked around vigilantly, occasionally lowering its head to graze. When it noticed the shadow of Soren's position, it immediately ran outside. Because it was not destroyed by humans, there were many wild animals in the wilderness. The dense vegetation greatly increased the number of wild animals. Sometimes one could even catch wild rabbits in the fields. Soren stopped in front of a puddle. He reached out and picked up some dark red soil, put it to the tip of his nose and smelled it. It was the smell of fresh blood. This place should be very close to where the kobolds lived. Kobolds were short, reptilian humanoid creatures that were cowardly and violent. They had scales on their bodies, and the color of their skin varied from dark rust to dark black. This provided them with a certain amount of protection, plus 1 innate armor. Their eyes were red and they had good night vision. They also had long tails that couldn't be curled. Most kobolds wore ragged clothes and they preferred red and orange. They would strip off the clothes of the dead and wear them. They were about 3 feet tall and weighed about 50 pounds. Kobolds could speak Draconic, but they still sounded like puppies. Like lizard men, they were oviparous. They were born in a litter, so it was quite common to encounter them in the wilderness. Don't underestimate them just because of their size. Normal kobolds were more powerful than normal civilians. Although they weren't strong, they were more agile, and their dexterity could reach 13 to 15 points. They also had the talents of mining and trap making. Most kobolds could make simple traps such as tripping ropes and pit traps. Because they were naturally timid, kobolds usually didn't act alone. They usually appeared in groups of 3 to 5. They would attack when there were twice the number of enemies. If the numbers were about the same, they would call for more companions or just give up. If the situation was not good, kobolds would quickly run away. This was similar to goblins. That's right. They could eat people. Soren continued to follow the footprints and took out his crossbow. It wasn't worth it to use a poison crossbow on these small things. Otherwise, the spoils of war wouldn't be as good as the items he had used. Normal crossbow bolts would be enough to deal with these small creatures. He still had half a bottle of wyvern venom left. To be safe, Soren still carried 3 of these crossbows with him. The goal was to guard against kobold sorcerers. Kobolds were the creatures most likely to become warlocks, even though most kobold warlocks didn't have high levels. However, the frequency of its appearance was a little scary. They were staunch supporters of the theory that warlocks were inherited from the dragon race. Because kobolds had a trace of dragon blood, they communicated in the dragon language, and 1 or 2 kobold warlocks would pop out from time to time. When dealing with powerful spellcasters, it was never too much to be cautious. There were more and more bloodstains in front of him. Soren stopped in front of a patch of grass that had obviously been moved. He took out his curved sword and fiddled with it. Immediately he saw a rope. If he accidentally touched it, something might fall on him or he might be tripped and hung upside down. In the past, many people had suffered because of these small creatures. At the beginning, many people, including Soren, had rushed out to kill them, but they didn't expect to be almost killed by these small creatures. Kobolds were born with plus 20 trap skills, which was equivalent to the standard of a normal hunter. There was a commotion in front of him, and he could vaguely hear the barking of dogs. Soren held his weapon and slowly approached. Kobolds had a good sense of smell, better than humans but not as good as wolfhounds, so he had to be careful when he went into stealth. A group of kobolds appeared in front of Soren. There were about 30 of them. Half of them were normal kobolds, and the other half were kobold warriors with equipment. There was also a dark red kobold holding a wooden stick. He wasn't sure if it was a kobold sorcerer, but it was standing next to a large pot. If the spellcasters of this world were disguised or if they didn't have any special equipment, it would be hard to tell who they were. For example, if a priest was fighting with a stick and after a long time he cast a divine spell, only then would you realize that he knew magic. Most of the time you had to rely on your own observation skills. The pot was set up with a wooden stick, and there were kobolds throwing firewood at the side. He couldn't see clearly what was cooking inside, but Soren guessed that it could be goblins, wild beasts, mushrooms, or weeds. Kobolds were omnivores. They ate both meat and grass. When they didn't have any prey, they would cook the mushrooms and weeds in the forest to fill their stomachs. If there was a lack of food, they would fight with the nearby goblins. Usually there was no clear winner, but after the fight, both sides would cook something in the pot. If they were frugal, it could last them for 10 days to half a month. A group of kobolds surrounded the cauldron, drooling and barking from time to time. Soren saw the goblins being cut into pieces, but when he saw the remains of a female human being, his face instantly became gloomy. Kobolds didn't dare to attack the village directly. They only dared to sneak in. Sometimes they didn't even dare to attack adult males. They only dared to kill children and women. Kobolds were cowardly and cruel. They would sneak up on women and children who were alone outside the village, kill them in a short period of time, and then drag their bodies back to the village. More than 30 kobolds weren't easy to deal with. Soren hid at the side and counted carefully, judging the danger level of this group of kobolds. There were about 10 kobold warriors. They were armed with short swords, clubs, and short spears. Some of them were even wearing leather armor. Kobolds were humanoid creatures and they knew how to make equipment. Next to them were 5 kobold archers. They were armed with short bows and daggers. The bows were all made by themselves, made from wood and animal tendons. Although they weren't very powerful, it was still very painful to shoot at close range. The other normal kobolds also had weapons, but most of them were crude wooden clubs. It wasn't too much of a problem to hit them. There was only one thing that couldn't be confirmed. Was the dark red kobold beside the pot a leader or a warlock? But without a doubt it was the most dangerous one. Kobold, large group, grade 1. Challenge rating, level 3, monster level 5, leader unit and kobold warlock may appear. Highest and lowest attributes, 17 and 8, total attribute points, 60 to 75. Special abilities: natural armor, trap crafting, night vision. Difficulty: C+, loot level, +1, mining, collecting. The kobolds' loot had bonus points because they had a habit of collecting shiny objects. Of course, not all of them were kindlers. It was possible that some of them were gold, sand, and ores that they had dug out. In the information collected by Soren, many monsters would have loot bonuses based on their own habits, which meant that monsters of the same level would end up with a higher loot than monsters of the same level. Goblins also liked to collect, but unfortunately they often ended up with trash. There was a slight noise. Soren began to move towards the bonfire from the side. He had to get rid of the dark red kobold first. Only then could he ensure that this battle would be much easier. Challenge rating: Level 3 meant that he would need 5 professions that were around level 3 to deal with them easily. It wasn't easy for Soren to move alone. The most important thing was that he couldn't be surrounded. Swoosh! A crossbow bolt flew out. The dark red kobold next to the bonfire let out a scream, and the entire kennel was alarmed. Sounds similar to the barking of a puppy could be heard. After the initial panic, the kobolds began to swarm around with their weapons in hand. They quickly discovered Soren with their night vision. A group of kobold warriors growled and charged towards him. When they realized that their enemies were far fewer than them, kobolds would become more aggressive. Soren didn't rush to meet them. He almost immediately rolled to the side to dodge the arrow. The place where he was originally standing was instantly filled with arrows. The kobold's short bows were quite threatening. The curved sword in his hand glinted coldly. In just one exchange, 2 kobolds had their stomachs cut open by Soren. However, because of this momentary pause, one of the kobolds pounced towards his leg and opened its mouth to bite him. They had sharp teeth. Bang! Soren twisted his waist and kicked out, sending the kobold flying 5 meters away. He forcefully twisted his body and dodged a dagger, then swung his leg to kick another kobold that was pouncing at him. In just 30 seconds, Soren had killed 6 kobolds, but the 30 or so kobolds that had gathered together also pounced on him. His leg was slashed by a short sword, but fortunately, it was only a small cut. The arrow from the short bow hit Soren, but it didn't penetrate his leather armor. Instead, it killed a kobold beside him. The kobold warriors with the strength of a level 1 warrior surrounded Soren. These 3-foot-tall creatures were very troublesome. Every time they attacked, they would stab at the back of Soren's leg, forcing him to bend down. The kobolds had the rolling skill and they knew how to use their body size to roll and dodge. Crescent moon slash. There was no space to dodge the attacks coming from all directions. Soren gritted his teeth and used his leather armor to block 2 of the attacks. He then twisted his waist and spun around with his curved sword. 3 kobolds fell to the ground, their stomachs all cut open. But at this moment, the dark red kobold that was shot by Soren's poison crossbow shakily stood up. It uttered a strange syllable, then stretched out its hand and pushed forward. A 60-degree fan-shaped flame spewed out. Soren was the first to bear the brunt of the flame. His clothes were immediately set ablaze, followed by the kobold beside him. It was directly burned by the flame. Burning hand. Chapter 51. After the initial panic, the normal kobolds slowly regained their composure. They picked up some stones from the ground and threw them at Soren. Even though the stones didn't deal much damage, they still hurt when they hit him, especially when more than 10 stones were thrown at him from all directions. Soren's 20 points of dexterity didn't help much. No matter how hard he tried to dodge, there wasn't enough space for him to get hit. Even though the damage was only 1 point, it still hurt a lot. Burning hand. With his ability to recognize spells, Soren rolled away in an instant. He still remembered quite a lot of the drow swordsmanship, and he instantly cut off the legs of 3 kobolds nearby. This move was once nicknamed Earth Rolling Blade, because it didn't look good. Not many people learned it, but almost all melee fighters learned it because it was a life-saving skill in a chaotic battle. Rangers, warriors, and wanderers who had advanced into Earthly Hall swordsmen were top-notch experts in chaotic battles. This set of combat skills required high coordination, agility, flexibility, speed, and internal organs. The drow swordsmanship focused on attacking the lower body. Soren had seen an expert cut off the legs of more than 10 enemies in an instant. The enemies didn't even touch the corner of his clothes, and the ground was littered with severed limbs. True experts wouldn't fly around in the air because there was no place to borrow or deflect the force. They would become live targets before they even landed. The most they used was diving and jumping. Even if they could jump up to a height of 5 to 6 meters or even 10 meters, they wouldn't expose themselves in the air. The flames on Soren's body were extinguished as he rolled on the ground. However, as the Kobold Warlock moved, the flames from Burning Hand followed. This was one of the most troublesome level 1 spells, and it was like maggots in one's bones. Soren gritted his teeth, grabbed a kobold's corpse and threw it at the sorcerer. About 50 pounds was still within his explosive range. The kobold's corpse was thrown directly at the sorcerer, and at the same time, its spell was interrupted. Soren was caught off guard by the kobolds who were jumping and rolling around in all directions. Once again he was hit by a sword. Soren twisted his waist and got up. The moment he got up, he grabbed the ankle of a kobold with one hand. The kobold let out a terrified cry. He swung the kobold in a circle, forcing the enemies around him to back away. Then he bent his body and jumped 5 meters away, breaking out of the encirclement of the kobolds. In a chaotic battle, one must not be surrounded by enemies. Otherwise, no matter how high one's evasion and reflexes were, it would be useless. This was because there was not enough space for one to move around. In the end, one would still have to face them head-on. Swoosh. Soren took out his crossbow again and shot an arrow at the Kobold Warlock. Some of the kobolds took out their short bows and started shooting at Soren. However, their poor archery skills were unable to hit Soren, who was moving at high speed. Instead, they hit the other kobolds behind him. Clang. Soren pulled out his scimitar and spun it around, successfully blocking an arrow. Perhaps it was because he suddenly felt good, he actually used the blade to block 3 arrows consecutively. Die. Soren once again pounced at the Kobold Warlock in the distance. Spellcasters were weak in close combat, and their physique was far inferior to that of warriors. He was confident that he could cut the Kobold Warlock in front of him into pieces with one strike. Frost Palm. The Kobold Warlock suddenly struck out with its palm. A faint blue light appeared in the center of its palm. Soren, who was charging at him, was instantly enveloped by a cold aura. From his scimitar to his arm, and then to his eyebrows, his entire body was covered in a thin layer of frost. The bone-chilling cold seeped into his body, and even his hands became stiff. Shadow Strike. Soren gritted his teeth and endured the first circle spell, Frost Palm. He rushed in front of the Kobold Warlock and instantly swung his scimitar down. A formless shadow energy gathered, and the Kobold Warlock's head was instantly chopped off. The thin layer of frost on its body was shattered and quickly melted away. The frost formed by magic would not last for too long. It would usually dissipate after a while. Spellcasters were always this dangerous. Fortunately, the Kobold Warlock was already dead. Soren didn't have time to look behind him. He kicked his legs and pounced at the Kobold Archer in the distance. Once the leader died, the Kobold Warlock would collapse. In other words, if they felt that they couldn't defeat the enemy, they would start to run away. Soren had spent so much effort and naturally he didn't want the enemy to run away. He had to kill as many of them as possible before the Kobold Warlock's morale collapsed. This was because once the kobolds started to flee, Soren wouldn't be able to find them in the complex environment of the forest. It would be equivalent to losing hundreds of slaughter EXP for nothing. This was also the reason why the kobolds in the wilderness were so difficult to kill. Once they couldn't defeat the enemy, they would run away faster than hyenas. You could either surround them or use ranged attacks to kill them. Otherwise you could only hunt them down one by one. Most importantly, they knew how to split up and run. The death of their leader caused the kobolds to panic. Some of the more cowardly ones tried to escape, while the braver ones wavered. After all, there was only one enemy and it seemed to be injured. Most of them were kobold warriors that surrounded them. In their eyes, they outnumbered the enemy. At the very least, they wouldn't easily run away until more than half of them were dead or injured. The battle had been going on for a few minutes. Soren's continuous attacks had consumed a lot of his stamina, and his movements were slower than before. Although he managed to dodge most of the attacks, he was still injured. It was just that the injuries weren't fatal. Injuries in the wilderness were unavoidable, especially when there were too many enemies. His leather armor blocked the arrows and most of the wounds were just scratches on his skin. There were also some bruises caused by rocks. The arrows didn't hit Soren many times, but the rocks did hit him many times. Since they didn't have to worry about killing their own kind, the kobolds threw a lot of rocks at him. When the rocks hit Soren, they also made the other kobolds cry out in pain. The real damage was from the first circle spells Burning Hand and Frost Palm. The former caused 8 points of burn damage, while the latter caused 6 points of frostbite. If it wasn't for his profession level 5, he would have been put into a heavily injured status, and his strength would have been reduced by half. However, as his injuries worsened and his stamina was depleted, Soren started to feel a little powerless. He wasn't a warrior. If it was a level 5 warrior, he would have just worn a chainmail and he would have been able to kill the kobolds. If he had a shield, the battle would have been even easier. The only thing he had to worry about was his stamina not being able to keep up. If he was too slow, he would be kited by the kobolds, and he wouldn't be able to use his explosive power to rush to the side of the kobold sorcerer. Armor greatly affected his movement speed and reaction speed. Level up the rogue class. Facing the remaining 20 kobolds, Soren decisively chose to level up. A row of data appeared in front of his eyes. The rogue class has leveled up to level 6. Received 24 DX 20 plus INT 18 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Skill points, HP increased by 11, profession HP 6 plus, con 19 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Received 1 free attribute point. Obtained 1 talent point, obtained 1 weapon point. Soren didn't have time to allocate other attributes, so he directly added 1 free attribute point to vitality, and his vitality increased from 19 points to 20 points. A surge of vitality burst out from Soren's body. His originally tired body immediately recovered, and the 20 points of vitality even made his wounds slightly itchy. Even the stones that the kobolds threw at him didn't hurt or itch. Extraordinary domain. The 20 points of vitality brought about a huge difference, and at the same time, it also restored his stamina to its peak. Soren, who was originally a lot slower, suddenly burst out with power. The curved sword in his hand drew a cold light, and directly cut a kobold in half. He then took a deep breath, jumped and dived. The moment he landed, he swung his sword and killed 2 kobold archers on the spot. Even the short bows made of hardwood were cut in half when they blocked his attack. Spinning strike. Although he didn't have any combat abilities, Soren still relied on his abundant stamina and extraordinary dexterity to perform the Rogue Blade Master's moves. His body spun 360 degrees on the spot, and the curved sword drew an arc in the trajectory of the arc, cutting 3 kobolds from their shoulders to their waists. Then, the moment he retracted his sword, he stabbed down and nailed a kobold to the ground. The morale of the kobolds finally collapsed. The ordinary kobolds began to throw away their weapons and run away. Even the kobold warriors were hesitant and fearful because the enemy in front of them seemed to have suddenly become stronger. Soren didn't stop at all. Wherever his curved sword went, limbs would be cut off. Before the kobolds went into the forest, he killed the warriors one by one, and then began to clean up the other kobolds. Unfortunately. After all, he was only one person and there were still a dozen or so kobolds that ran away. They dived into the bushes and soon disappeared without a trace. It was very troublesome to catch up with them. Clang. Soren sheathed his sword, let out a long sigh, and then began to bandage his wounds. The arrow wound was a little better because the leather armor blocked it. However, the wound on his leg that was cut by the kobold needed a simple bandage. A row of data appeared in front of him. The battle is over. After a difficult battle, your skills have improved. Dodge, move, +1 dodge, roll, +2 parry, +1 listen, location by listening to the wind, +1. Chapter 52. Cynocephaly were quite strong. Although they didn't look tall, only about 3 feet, 1 meter, tall, advanced warriors had high strength. Perhaps this was because they really did have a trace of dragon blood in them. Advanced cynocephaly warriors could reach 13 to 15 strength. If it wasn't for Soren's armor, his bones would have been injured. Soren wasn't in a hurry to collect the loot. He first bandaged his leg. He still had some healing potions, but he didn't use them. 60 silver dirhams could buy a basic healing potion which could restore 8 to 10 HP. There was no need to use them here. He had just obtained the regeneration ability from 20 vitality. After a simple bandage, he gradually recovered. He should be fine by tomorrow. After all, he didn't hurt his bones. Regeneration, elementary, gifted ability. Your strong physique has exceeded the range of mortals. What was originally a fatal injury may now only be a serious injury to you. Your strong vitality has allowed you to regenerate like a troll. You can gradually recover from any injuries below the serious injury status with time. Although you can't regrow a broken arm like a troll, as your vitality gradually increases, you will be able to do so one day. Health regeneration rate +1 per hour. This was the lowest level of regeneration. The HP recovery rate was calculated on an hourly basis. In other words, Soren could recover 1 HP per hour. He was now a level 6 rogue with 63 HP. If he didn't lose an arm or a leg, he would be able to fully recover within 3 days even if he was on his last breath. Don't underestimate this ability. Although it can't affect your recovery ability during battle, it determines that you can recover quickly after battle. Many melee professions relied on this ability to save their lives countless times until they reached the realm of legends. As for creatures like trolls, their constitution started at 25. If there was no way to suppress their regeneration ability, they could grow their heads back even if they were cut off. These creatures were at the level of biochemical beast. In this world, it was impossible to drink a potion and instantly recover to full health. Even a priest's divine spell couldn't do it. Many divine spells would overdraw energy after casting and enter a weakened state for a period of time. As for reviving? You thought too much. That was a level 9 divine spell. If you wanted to revive someone, you would have to ask the god of death of the river Styx first. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many people who died on the path to becoming legends. As long as there was a priest in the party, they could revive someone after they died. It was a simple matter. Soren had just calculated that he had obtained around 900 slaughter EXP from this battle. The normal Cynocephalys EXP and the Cynocephalys S EXP, the Cynosepcephalys and the Cynocephalys EXPs. SSSSSSSSSSS. S's. Soren didn't have many part-time jobs. If he was a warrior, his strength was slightly lower. If he was a priest, his perception was lacking. When the time of troubles began, he would immediately become useless. He would not be able to use divine spells at all. Not to mention whether or not he had the talent to become a warlock, 16 points of charm was indeed a bit low. The only people who could take on a part-time job and display decent strength were probably the adepts. Regardless of whether it was an advancement or a part-time job, it was good. Of course, it was not as simple as just closing one's eyes. A warrior subclass required strength, a priest subclass required faith perception, and a wizard subclass required 25 points of knowledge and 15 points of intelligence. If he had the basic profession of a scholar, becoming a wizard would not be a problem. However, he was only a commoner, so he needed to improve his knowledge and skills. Becoming a part-time sorcerer was one direction. Soren was a bit hesitant as well. If he wanted to be a wizard, he would have to spend an extra 50% slaughter EXP. If he had a lot of slaughter experience, he naturally wouldn't care about these things. However, it was too difficult to gain slaughter experience. He killed so many kobolds and only got 900 points, which was not even enough to cover the cost of his soul energy. Advancing to a special profession required about 5,000 points of soul energy, slaughter experience, which was enough for him to directly level up to level 7 rogue. On the other hand, his subclass required 2,500 points of soul energy, slaughter experience, which was equivalent to the amount of slaughter experience he needed to level up by half a level. If he didn't know the power of magic very well, becoming a part-time sorcerer would quickly increase his strength. He really didn't want to do this. Because if he learned all kinds of random professions, the end result would be that he would not be able to do anything. For example, Soren's previous profession level was level 10 commoner, max, level 10 rogue, level 10 lurker. Lurker was the advanced profession of a rogue and was not considered a part-time sorcerer. To reach this level of strength, he had accumulated about 2 million slaughter experience, and when he finally entered the realm of legends, he directly awakened the legendary ability Shadow Realm. However, if he were to take on other professions, the 2 million slaughter experience would only be enough for him to level up both professions to an average of level 14. A level 14 warrior wouldn't be able to withstand 10 strikes in front of him, and a level 14 wizard might not even have time to cast a spell before being killed on the spot by his shadow step. It was hard to say whether it was better to be a full-time sorcerer or a part-time sorcerer. A part-time sorcerer's ability could allow him to deal with all kinds of sudden situations and be at ease in any environment. At the same time, it could complement each other's abilities and give him 3 to 5 extra free attribute points. However, it was a pity that the speed of mastering a legendary ability was relatively slow. Although some could be obtained through the fusion of professions, it was still not as good as a full-time sorcerer. In the past, many people took on part-time sorcerers for the extra free attribute points, and they even gave up many powerful legendary abilities for it. For example, the legendary rogue's Shadow Realm was a powerful ability that allowed one to directly teleport into the Shadow Realm and so on. It required many prerequisites. If one chose to take on a part-time job, these abilities would be very difficult to obtain in a short period of time, unless one killed 1 or 2 gods and obtained a large amount of soul energy. Specialized classes had to rely on teammates because there were some battles that one could not handle alone. However, the advantage was that one could obtain the ability of the legendary realm as soon as possible. After all, one did not have to be distracted to learn the skills, specialties, of other classes. Profession level was only a part of one's strength. Many professions needed to master many special abilities. As for the final achievement, it was not easy to evaluate because there were not many people who could survive until they reached the legendary realm, let alone improve the two methods to the limit. Professions in the legendary realm could adapt to all kinds of complicated environments. A legendary character of a single profession would develop a certain aspect to the limit. For example, a wizard with a profession level of 40 or so could have enough spell slots to blow up a continental shelf. Therefore, most people chose to work part-time. For example, many thieves would subclass as a warrior to improve their melee combat abilities. Part-time jobs were very time-consuming. If Soren succeeded in becoming a wizard, then he would have to invest a lot of slaughter EXP into it. At the same time, he would have to train and master many wizard specialties. The energy required for this was very shocking. He would have to train at least 3 or more spellcasting specialties to reach the level of other wizards of the same level. During this time, it would be difficult for his thief strength to increase. Without the help of specialties, he would not be able to exert his full potential in battle. This was because throwing a low-level spell would not be as good as slashing with a sword. The biggest advantage of taking on a part-time job was the ability to adapt, as well as the use of various abilities. For example, greater invisibility and backstab were the reasons why it was worth taking on a part-time job. Otherwise, if the professions could not complement each other, the final result would be that the gains would not make up for the losses. It would be a waste of one's time, and at the same time, it would also limit one's achievements. After all, there were very few people who could obtain divinity. Without divinity, there was a limit to the amount of energy a soul could bear. Not to mention the difficulty of obtaining slaughter EXP. In order to obtain about 2 million slaughter EXP, Soren had to kill more than half of a hand's worth of dragons and liches. Of course, at that time, the slaughter EXP was distributed by the whole team. Now he was taking all the slaughter EXP alone. In fact, if it was not so difficult to obtain slaughter EXP, there would not be so many people who fell on the road to becoming a legend. It could be said that in Soren's memory, except for a few lucky people who were lucky enough to kill the gods who fell to the mortal world, or directly obtained the shards of divinity, others walked all the way to the legendary realm, who knew how many hardships they had experienced. It was a bumpy road full of blood and tears. Perhaps it was because they had experienced too many hardships. These people who reached the legendary realm by themselves were all masters. Their challenge level was the same as the original wizards in the storyline. To kill them, the difficulty was roughly equivalent to besieging a legendary wizard's tower. P.S. These are a little introduction to the part-time jobs. It is good that everyone has an impression. The following will be easier to understand. There are some things in this book that are more obscure, so Fu Tu has tried to use simpler language to explain. Chapter 53. Soren kicked the bonfire next to him to extinguish it. Then he began to allocate his weapon points and expertise points. Warriors would have an additional weapon point before they advanced. On the other hand, thieves would have to wait until they reached profession level 6 before they could get their first weapon point. The next weapon point would be profession level 12. Weapon points were similar to specialties, but they could only be added to weapon specialties, so there was some skill involved in allocating them. Soren already knew how to increase the strength of thieves like the back of his hand. However, he had another idea because he had a legendary ability called Omnipotent Hands. Although this ability was in a sealed state, it still couldn't change the fact that it was a passive ability. Omnipotent Hands was a legendary thief's innate ability. When using any weapon in battle, the legendary thief could gain proficiency in weapons. The weapon specialties mastered by melee professions were upgraded step by step. For example, the most basic, simple weapon mastery, military weapon mastery, and exotic weapon mastery were the most basic specialties that allowed them to master various types of weapons. Then, if they wanted to improve further, they could advance to simple weapon mastery, military weapon mastery, and exotic weapon mastery. Other melee professions and mages could only master one type of weapon. For example, the priest's warhammer, spiked hammer and flail mastery, or the droll's staff, cane and scythe mastery. This was the weapon mastery. But if you wanted to improve further, you couldn't learn all kinds of weapons. Next, you had to choose a weapon that you were best at and the most comfortable to use, and then upgrade it to a higher level. Among all professions, only pure-blooded warriors could directly master the military weapon mastery specialty after advancing. Other melee professions had to choose one of the weapons to train at the weapon mastery level if they wanted to continue to improve. For example, Soren chose the curved sword mastery. Scimitar specialization. As the number of battles increases, you will become more proficient in using the scimitar. Among 100 people who use the scimitar in battle, your ability will be one of the best. You are an expert in using curved swords in battle. Even the drows in the underworld are not as good at this weapon as you. You know how to use it to cause the most damage and how to hit the enemy more easily. Accuracy +2, damage +2. If they continue to level up from the specialist level, they would reach the master level. Purebred warriors, without any subclasses, could master all the way up to military weapon master. Then they could choose to advance to sword saint or weapon master, directly obtaining the grandmaster level of a single weapon specialty. However, other professions couldn't do the same. After all, they didn't train with different weapons all year round like warriors. They could only choose a single type of weapon to level up. For example, Soren's curved sword grandmaster. The highest level of proficiency in weapons was the master level, and only pure-blooded warriors could reach military weapon master. Other professions simply did not have the energy and time to do so. If they wanted to master it, they would have to slowly train all the military types of weapons to the master level and finally fuse them into the military weapon master specialty. Under normal circumstances, no one would be stupid enough to waste too much time on this. After all, they might as well use that time to improve their other abilities. Under normal circumstances, some pure-blooded warriors would obtain the military weapon mastery specialty at level 1, military weapon mastery at level 3, military weapon mastery at level 6, and finally military weapon master at level 9. Finally, around level 12, they would improve their other abilities and rely on advancing to sword saint or weapon master to obtain the grandmaster level of a single weapon specialty. However, the price of this advancement meant that they would completely give up on the training of shield blocking, weapon parrying, and armor mastery. This kind of warrior's ability to move in battle would be affected even if they wore full-body armor. If they didn't advance to sword saint, they would only be able to wear medium armor at most. Once they wore heavy armor or full-body armor, their combat ability would be greatly reduced. This was the violent warrior that many people liked at that time. After the grandmaster level was the legendary weapon specialty. If one was a sword saint or weapon master, they would generally be able to master their first legendary weapon specialty at around level 15. However, the price of this specialty was that sword saints would basically be unable to wear armor in battle. Weapon masters would also not be able to train their shield blocking ability like other warriors. Soren had the omnipotent hands specialty. Although this specialty was in a sealed state, he still had this ability. It was just that he couldn't use it. In other words, Soren should have the effects of simple weapon mastery, military weapon mastery, and exotic weapon mastery, but he couldn't actively use these abilities. Even if he couldn't actively use them, it didn't mean that these abilities didn't exist. It also didn't mean that these abilities couldn't be used as a prerequisite for mastering weapons. Therefore, when Soren held his breath and looked at the weapon specialization's advanced specialty, his heart couldn't help but beat faster. He saw it. He saw the weapon specialty curved sword mastery in his own data. Although omnipotent hands was in a sealed state, it still met the prerequisite for mastering weapons. Advanced to curved sword mastery. Soren excitedly chose the curved sword mastery specialty. After that, the other weapon specializations began to disappear, and the curved sword master specialty appeared. It wasn't as troublesome to advance a specialty from a single weapon to a master-level specialty. It didn't require any other requirements. As long as he had the prerequisite weapon mastery, and weapon mastery, he could directly obtain a master-level specialty from a single weapon type. Therefore, Soren's mastery of the curved sword master specialty was even faster than the warrior's mastery of military weapon mastery. Curved sword master. You are a master of using curved swords. It is as flexible as your arms. Among 1,000 people who use curved swords in battle, your ability is at the top. You are an expert in using curved swords in battle. If you are willing, many people will be willing to take you as their master. You can even open a dojo in the city that teaches you how to use curved swords. Accuracy +3, damage +3, attack speed +1. He really obtained a master-level curved sword specialty. Soren's face revealed a hint of excitement. He slowly grasped the curved sword in his hand. He didn't expect to obtain his first master-level specialty when he was only level 6. Clang. Soren kicked a piece of wood up and instantly swung his sword. The curved sword flashed with a cold light, and its speed was even faster than before. He could even feel the blade slicing through the air. When he chopped the wood in half, he didn't waste any of his strength. The weapon was like a part of his body. He knew how to use it to its maximum potential. Clang. The wood fell to the ground. Soren instantly swung his sword twice and chopped the wood into 4 pieces. As expected, master-level specializations are extraordinary. Soren slowly sheathed his sword. Even though he only swung his sword twice in an instant, only those who had tried to wield a weapon would know how much strength, speed, and accuracy were required. Let's use a simple example. Professional boxers usually had the ability to throw 7 to 10 punches per second. The boxing king Tyson was said to be able to throw 12 punches per second. However, if the strength of his punches was guaranteed, he would only be able to throw 3 punches per second. This was without taking into account his luck. In other words, the boxing king Tyson's strength was about the same as a level 6 monk. There wasn't much of a difference in their strength, attributes, and attack speed. The only difference was that the monk's perception was higher, while the boxing king Tyson's strength was higher. Many external martial arts experts could reach this level. Using a weapon would definitely not be as fast as punching. There was a 1-point difference in attack speed between the two. If Soren switched to master-level barehanded combat, he would be able to throw 4 punches per second if his strength was guaranteed. In other words, other than the fact that his strength wasn't up to par with the boxing king Tyson standards, he was better in all aspects. Back then, many people liked to turn historical figures into adult character cards. Of course, they would leave behind more comprehensive data about them. One of the more famous ones was Bruce Lee. In the end, his character card was equivalent to a level 7 monk, level 1 fist master. If the power of 1-inch punch was replaced by the ability 1-inch punch, and not taking into account the monk's energy, the attack speed and attributes of both sides were about the same. Their explosive power should be about the same as well. Bruce Lee Human, Grade 2. Challenge Rating, 5. Level 7 Monk, Level 1 Fist Master. Dangerous Target. Estimated Attributes, Strength 17, Dexterity 18, Constitution 16, Electric Shock, Intelligence 11, Wisdom 16, Charm 15. Special Abilities, Hand-to-Hand Combat, Grandmaster. 1-inch Punch, Grandmaster. Nunchaku, Grandmaster. Powerful Whip Kick, Powerful Side Kick, Spinning Kick, Intuitive Evasion, Nimble Movement. Difficulty, B-. Difficulty, A+ when using Nunchaku. According to the statistics, this was one of the few people who were close to Grade 3. Because of the innate potential of the people on Earth, their attributes were greatly reduced. At the same time, their HP was only around 20 points. They didn't have the vitality and recovery ability of many creatures in this world. Basically, a level 5 warrior would be unparalleled among ordinary people. After all, there was only one Bruce Lee in the billions of people on Earth. The ratio of world-class boxing champions was also 1 in a billion. As for professions above Grade 3, they were beyond the scope of human beings. There was no comparison between the two. When a Grade 3 barbarian went berserk, his strength was simply terrifying. P.S. This chapter took almost 6 hours to edit and rewrite. I'm speechless. You guys have to make do. You should be able to understand. Chapter 54. After distributing all the points, Soren began to clean up the battlefield. There wasn't anything good on the kobolds, so Soren began to look for boxes. These creatures liked to hide the good things they collected, and most of them were hidden near their gathering place. Since they were only about 1 meter tall, kobolds usually didn't carry any loot with them. First, he rummaged through the kobold sorcerer's corpse and found some random items. Unfortunately, they were all trash. Soren then began to observe the surroundings, and soon found a stone that was a little different. The ground nearby had been dug up. He pulled out his curved sword and began to dig. He directly lifted the stone and found a wooden box buried below. It looked very simple, but when he took it out, it was heavy. He opened it with the hilt of his sword and looked inside. It was full of gold sand. He didn't expect these kobolds to be so rich. Gold sand was an unrefined gold ore. It was actually gold with very low purity. It could be exchanged for kindler in the temple of the goddess of wealth. Most of the priests of the goddess of wealth took this job and it was generally fair. Soren reached his hand into the gold sand and felt around. He found a piece of agate, a small piece of obsidian, 3 pieces of opaline, and 1 or 2 stones that he couldn't identify. Kobolds had a talent for mining and they also liked to live in caves. Even in the wilderness they could occasionally find some good things in the caves. If they defeated a creature, the nature of the low-level dragon bloodline made the kobolds automatically collect the shiny objects. Not bad. Soren carefully poured the gold sand into the multidimensional bag, and then put the stones inside. He muttered to himself, "Looks like it's worth about 100 kindler. 20 kindler weighed 1 pound, and the gold sand just now should be worth about 60 or 70 pieces. There were more ores in this world and these stones were worth about 30 kindler. However, if he wanted to sell them he would have to find a jewelry merchant, and the price might be lowered. Normal kobold tribes wouldn't have accumulated so much loot, but it was probably because of the kobold wizard. Wherever there was a wizard, the loot would always be higher. If they killed the spellcasters, stripping them naked was a very normal thing. The kobold sorcerer was only around level 2. It didn't have anything good on it except for the ebony staff +1. This was the least valuable rare grade equipment. It was made of a special kind of wood that was relatively sturdy. It was like ironwood and didn't have any additional effects. However, it was very hard and could be used to block weapons. It was about 10 kindlers worth. It was about the same price as Soren's scimitar, but not many people were willing to buy it. The low-grade droll would like to carry it with them because it would not affect their spell casting. It could also be used as a spell casting material at critical moments because it was made of wood. Soren took the valuable items and quickly left. The smell of blood was very likely to attract nearby beasts, including wolves, ogres, gnolls, and other creatures. If he stayed here he might run into them. He had suffered a lot in the past. He was almost turned into dumplings by the gnolls who were attracted by the smell of blood. It was very difficult to keep these corpses for more than 2 days. Other creatures would probably be attracted by night. If he was strong enough he could wait for them to come. Unfortunately, Soren was still injured. It would be fine if the wolves were attracted, but if the gnolls were attracted he would be screwed. Gnolls had a monster level of 3. If they had an advanced profession, their monster level and their profession level would be equivalent to a level 5 warrior. 1 or 2 gnolls would be fine, but the problem was that gnolls usually moved in groups of 3 to 5. If I want to become a wizard I'll just need a spellbook. Soren returned along the way he came. There was a human village nearby. He wanted to see if he could spend the night there. It was too dangerous to sleep alone in the wilderness. If he was ambushed in the middle of the night he would be done for. Moreover, it was difficult for him to sleep well. He basically couldn't fall asleep in the wilderness. At most he could only take a nap. Spellbooks were not cheap. If he was a wizard he would naturally bring one with him. However, if he wanted to advance he would have to spend money to buy one. It was worth about 150 kindler coins. This was the most common spellbook. A special spellbook could be worth thousands of kindler coins. Bang! The dull sound of a gunshot suddenly spread far and wide in the wilderness. Soren was a little dazed when he heard the gunshot. He quickly hid in the shadows and rushed in the direction of the gunshot. Was it a gnome or a dwarf? Primitive firearms rarely appeared among humans. Alchemy products were strictly controlled, and it was very difficult to buy them in the black market. The power of firearms was not as great as people thought. They were good against ordinary people but not so good against professionals. Even sniper rifles made by alchemy were not as useful against high-grade professionals as people thought. It was even more difficult to deal with spellcasters. Some people once joked that if they did not make nuclear warheads, they would not be able to threaten legendary spellcasters. Of course, this was just an exaggeration. The churches of the gods had very strict restrictions on alchemy products, second only to the taboo research on life creation. It was said that this was to avoid the catastrophe of the Arcane Empire. There were records that the floating fortress of the Arcane Empire broke the continental shelf into 8 pieces. Even the largest nuclear weapon was not that powerful. Even if nuclear weapons were to be used to destroy the Earth, it would at most destroy humans and creatures. It would not be a big problem for the Earth itself. However, there were spells and alchemy weapons in this world that could directly destroy a plane. They could even sink a piece of the continental shelf to the bottom of the sea. Of course, that was during the Arcane Empire. It was several eras before. The arcanists of that time were very powerful, even more so than the wizards of today. The golems, robots, that the wizards made now. They were the descendants of the Arcane Empire's magic-powered constructs. Soren had seen them when he was exploring the ruins at the bottom of the sea. If someone told him that they were superpowered armors made by humans in the interstellar era, they would have believed it. They had almost been wiped out. At first, it was strange to see them, but they gradually got used to it. If Soren remembered correctly, the dwarven alchemists of Toldra had already started to research rocket technology. In the end, they accidentally injured a black dragon and brought about a devastating disaster. Alchemy products were still very strictly controlled at this time. Since the gods had yet to descend and the churches were unprecedentedly powerful, there were not many people who dared to use alchemy weapons. Grey dwarves? Soren's pupils shrank as he hid in the shadows. About a few hundred meters away, a group of grey dwarves was attacking a wizard. Some of them were holding primitive guns as thick as bowls. This was what attracted Soren's attention. The wizard was surrounded in the middle. There were more than 10 grey dwarven warriors around him. Asterisk bang bang bang. Asterisk 3 consecutive gunshots rang out. The bullets were fired at the wizard, but when they were about a meter away from him, the stone pellets were deflected and flew in another direction. Otherwise, they would have exhausted all their kinetic energy and landed directly at the wizard's feet. High-grade mage armor? Soren stealthily snuck in. His expression was serious. This was the first time he had seen high-grade wizards fight. A grade 3 wizard. His profession should be at least level 10. He didn't seem to be a human wizard. A group of grey dwarven warriors attacked him, but no matter if it was swords, axes, or bullets, they were all blocked at least a meter away from him. This was a wizard's defensive force field. Defensive force fields were divided into 2 types: armor and deflection. Armor was used to block the attack from the front, while deflection was used to deflect the attack. The level 1 mage armor had a defensive strength of 20, which wasn't enough to withstand one strike from Soren. However, the defensive strength would increase according to the wizard's level and strength. If a high-grade wizard cast mage armor, it could at least block 3 strikes from Soren. Since he didn't have any rare-grade weapons, his strike could at most deal 20 damage. At that time, many melee professions called it the at-type force field, and complained that the wizards were indeed cheating. Chapter 55. A group of Duergar warriors surrounded him. The wizard's barrier was finally broken. After all, there was a limit to how much damage it could take. However, when a Duergar warrior's axe landed on the wizard's body, it bounced back as if it had hit a marble wall. Stone skin. Soren already knew the outcome of the battle. Stone skin could take up to 150 points of damage. They had to surround the wizard and attack him in order to break through his stone skin. There didn't seem to be any high-grade warriors among the grey dwarves. Just a bunch of grade 2 warriors wouldn't be able to kill a high-grade wizard. As expected, one of the Duergar warriors was stunned for a moment, then suddenly turned around and chopped off his companion's head with his axe. Enraged charm. The Duergar warrior suddenly went on a killing spree. He killed 3 of his companions in one go before being killed by the others. Not a single spellcaster? Soren looked around and pursed his lips. They didn't even bring a priest. Are they trying to get themselves killed? It's about time for a large-scale attack, right? As soon as he finished speaking, a gust of wind suddenly blew across the battlefield. The wizard's speed suddenly became extraordinary. In an instant he had opened up a distance of nearly 50 meters. He then quickly cast a spell, and a spider web spread out, trapping many grey dwarves in it. Spider web was based on strength and dexterity. Could be used to dodge or break free. However, it was difficult for low-grade warriors to dodge a high-grade wizard's web. The wizard quickly cast a spell, and a basketball-sized fireball appeared in front of him. He pointed his finger forward, and the fireball immediately flew out and exploded in the middle of the Duergar warriors. Fireball. Perhaps it was because of the game of pickle in the 21st century, but many people thought that fireball was a spell that could be casually thrown out. However, fireball's level was not low. It was a level 3 evocation spell, and could only be cast by a level 6 wizard. The power of the spell was similar to what was happening right in front of their eyes. With a loud bang, it was as if a grenade had exploded in the middle of the Duergar warriors, and a Duergar warrior was instantly blasted into pieces. The scorching flames wreaked havoc, and the impact of the explosion sent the grey dwarves nearby flying. The Duergar warriors who were lucky enough to survive also spat out mouthfuls of blood. Many of their fur and clothes were on fire. Around professional level 12. Soren could roughly estimate the level of the enemy based on the fireball's power. If a wizard of a higher level cast a fireball, at least half of the dwarves would have died from the fireball's attack. The fireball spell was one of the spells he was most familiar with. There was a time when the 5 fireball holy sect was popular. 5 rank 2 magi would cast a fireball spell at the same time. The concentrated area of effect explosion and high-temperature flames would directly wipe out the enemies within a 60 feet radius, leaving behind a crater with a diameter of 3 meters. He shouldn't have many spell slots left, right? Soren furrowed his brows as he glanced at them. His expression showed a hint of eagerness. Even though the spellcasters seemed to have cheats, they were still at the mercy of others after casting their spells. It seemed that the wizard had been fighting for a long time. There were at least 20 or 30 Duergars who had died nearby, and he must have used up a lot of spell slots. Spider spawn. The wizard threw something and it landed on the corpse of a Duergar. Immediately, 2 spider eggs appeared and quickly expanded. Finally, 2 venomous spiders the size of millstones emerged from the dark green liquid. After the venomous spiders appeared, they hissed and then quickly rushed to the other Duergars under the wizard's command. Soon 2 or 3 warriors were bitten to death. Soren's hair stood on end. He looked at them in shock and murmured, "Dark elves?" Spider spawn was a very obscure level 4 spell. Depending on the wizard's level, it could spawn 1 to 3 spiders in a short time. It mainly depended on the spellcasting materials and the wizard's level. Venomous spiders could be level 6 to 8, and special species of spiders could even be cultivated. Not only were they dangerous, but they also had spell-like abilities. This was a very rare spell that could only be learned by the wizards of the underground world. The ones who were best at it were the dark elf wizards and priests. This was because they believed in the spider queen Lolth, an evil and powerful deity. The wizard's protective force field was still intact, and he was not hurt at all. The Duergars finally began to despair. Some of them turned and ran, but they were bitten to death by the swift venomous spiders. Some wanted to fight with their lives, but their heads were blown off by the flying arcane missiles. A high-grade wizard's arcane missile could penetrate a 0.3 centimeter thick steel plate. It was equivalent to the power of a pistol shot from 100 meters away. Even if it did not hit the vital parts, it could still open a hole in the body. Sometimes it could even penetrate armor. Soren gave up the idea of taking the risk in his heart because the dark elves were very cunning. He definitely had some fatal spells that he had not used yet. From beginning to end. This was a massacre. A high-grade wizard had killed 30 low-grade Duergar warriors in a variety of ways. Apart from the initial danger of almost breaking the protective force field, there was basically nothing they could do to the wizard. Among all the professions, only a sword saint could break the protective force field of a wizard of the same rank in one hit. Shadow Step also allowed them to pass through the shadow passage and appear behind the enemy. The wizard's figure was getting farther and farther away. Dark elves wouldn't appear on the surface world for no reason. Soren was sure that something was going to happen, but he didn't know what it was. A wizard with a profession level of 12 had a high status. There weren't many reasons for him to appear in the wilderness alone. Chapter 56. Soren waited for a long time. When he was sure that the wizard had left, he walked towards the corpses of the gray dwarves. There should be something valuable on them. Although the high-ranked wizard didn't think much of it, he was still a thief with a little sister to feed. The more money he had, the better. The little girl would need to spend a lot of money in the future, so he had to prepare some savings. Besides, if he really wanted to spend money, a set of rare-grade equipment would cost him more than 3,000 Kindler coins. There were bloodstains everywhere on the ground, and it seemed like a sudden battle had taken place. Internal conflict? Soren looked at the footprints nearby and frowned. It seems like they were on the same side at first. I don't know why they suddenly started fighting. The footprints were very neat, as if a group of people were protecting something as they moved forward. The footprints behind him started to get messy. When a person was running at full speed, the footprints would naturally be different from when they were walking. Soren tried to reconstruct the scene in his mind, but he could only vaguely tell that the gray dwarves had suddenly attacked. Because there were traces of second-grade warriors charging on the ground, they were able to stimulate their potential in a short period of time and burst forward with astonishing speed. Even an ordinary warrior could reach the speed of an Olympic champion. What's this? Soren reached out and picked up a shard. He then turned over the 3 corpses and found a gray dwarf with a hole in his chest. There were traces of corrosion around the wound. Acid arrow? Soren carefully took off the ring on the corpse's finger, and a look of surprise appeared on his face. So they brought a wizard with them, but he was killed in an instant. There was a wizard in the Grey Dwarf's team. However, he was only a second-grade wizard, around level 5. Perhaps because the battle had happened so suddenly, he didn't have time to react before the high-ranked wizard killed him with an acid arrow. Soren touched the ring, and a faint glow of magic appeared on it. The smile on his face became more and more obvious. This was a low-ranked wizard's ring, and it could store an additional level 1 or 2 spells. It's worth at least 1,200 Kindler coins. Soren put the ring away and continued to rummage through the dead dwarf's body. He thought to himself, he didn't even touch the dead bodies of his peers. Either he's too rich to care, or there's something very important that he can't afford to delay. What else happened during this period of time? Damn it. Why didn't you pay more attention to the changes in the situation? Soren quickly took out a multidimensional bag. It was also a low-level multidimensional bag. Even though a rank 2 Magus wealth wasn't low, it still wasn't considered a tycoon. There were a lot of things inside and not many of them were valuable. Most arcanists had around 25 points of intelligence, which was equivalent to a biological computer. The memory of a normal person, even an excellent wizard, couldn't reach that level. This was why they had to carry a spellbook with them at all times. Mastering spells took a long time. A wizard with 18 points of intelligence would need at least half a month to learn a level 1 spell. However, it was much easier to memorize the spell after learning it. All they needed to do was spend some time meditating after casting the spell, and they could recreate the spell model. Therefore, the number of spells a wizard could learn was limited. Normally, a high-grade wizard would know many spells while a low-grade wizard would know very few. Only a legendary wizard would have enough time and energy to learn more spells. What's this? Sauron took out a special roll of paper. After opening it, he took a look and quickly put it away. There was a symbol of 3 tentacles on it. If he remembered correctly, it was called Shadow Tentacles. It was a level 4 spell that could summon 3 tentacles of energy to bind the enemy. The dwarf wizard didn't record it in his spellbook, which meant he was probably a wizard below level 7. A wizard's value was really high. Soren calculated the value of the loot. It was worth more than 2,000 Kindler coins. Oh whoa! While Soren was happily rummaging through the other corpses, a wolf's howl came from afar. He sped up and put everything into the multidimensional bag he just found. He then came to the corpses of the dwarves with primitive firearms. So it's a stone pellet gun. He picked up an alchemy weapon, weighed it in his hand, and then stuffed it into his multidimensional bag. This gun was as thick as an adult's arm, and it was made of polished stone bullets. It was a relatively low-level alchemy gun, and some dwarves would be equipped with it. Because of its primitive craftsmanship, its shooting range and accuracy were average, and its firing speed was not fast. Sometimes, its power was not as good as a crossbow or a longbow, especially the longbows of some human-like races. Its effective shooting range was more than 300 meters, and it could penetrate half a centimeter thick steel plate. It was like a sniper rifle. The craftsmanship of this primitive gun was similar to that of the 18th century. There were even better guns in the hands of the dwarves of Toteldry. Due to their inferior physique, these dwarves were very dedicated to alchemy research. Unfortunately, these weapons couldn't defeat a black dragon with a monster level of 24. In the end, the whole city was destroyed by the dragon's breath. It was estimated that this would happen in about a year. The howls of the wolves were getting closer and closer. Soren hurriedly cleaned up the corpses and headed toward the road. He didn't want to fight a pack of wolves right now. The sky was getting darker and darker, and many wild creatures were starting to move. The smell of blood here would attract many carnivores. As Soren was leaving, he saw a pair of ghostly green eyes in the forest. It was a Knoll scout. They could smell blood within a 1-kilometer radius, and they would spread out when hunting. When they found their prey, they would summon their companions through a special sound. It was likely that these wolves would have to fight the Knolls. There would be a carnival tonight, so it was better to stay away from them. Chapter 57. Any high-grade profession could be understood as a superhuman. Profession level 10 and above basically had 1 or 2 supernatural abilities. For example, the drow just now had some kind of spell on her body, which was why she could jump between trees. Soren was not curious enough to chase after her. It was normal to meet strangers in the wilderness. Some would talk for a short while, but most would just pass by. As long as the other party did not have any bad intentions, both parties would just nod at each other. Droll did not like to communicate with ordinary people, not even professionals. They were solitary and had their own goals. Most of them had strong beliefs and were neutral in their behavior. Sometimes they would attack anyone. In their eyes, balance was higher than good and evil, because they believed that good and evil in the world were relative. They were like a group of people who advocated inaction, but their aggressiveness was not weak at all. Many people who destroyed the nature of the forest would be mercilessly executed by them. There was a period of time when human alchemy research was popular, mainly because of the discovery of the ruins of the Arcane Empire. Many wizards found high-end alchemy knowledge from it, and they even developed a construction factory. However, the pollution caused by magic energy alchemy destroyed the water source, polluted the earth, killed animals, and destroyed the forest. This eventually led to the anger of the Droll group in the world. Terrible storms and lightning shrouded the whole new alchemy city, and in the end, everything was turned into ashes. There were not many records left of that battle. It was only known that the Droll defeated the army of steel golems. More than 10 legendary Droll fought at the same time, including the powerful Storm Lord. The wizards were badly hurt in this battle. One legendary wizard died and 2 legendary wizards were forced to turn into liches. Research on magic energy alchemy became a taboo. In order to appease the angry Droll, the Human World's Church began to increase the restrictions on magic energy alchemy. This was because the place where the alchemy city was built, the river was still full of black pollution. The nearby land was not suitable for human survival, and drinking the water would cause metal poisoning. The Droll stubbornly believed that this evil alchemy research would eventually destroy nature, causing irreparable damage to the environment, and eventually bring disaster to the whole world. So, even for the dwarves and gnomes, some alchemy research was still carried out in secret. Most of the wizards were not on good terms with the Droll, because many of their academic studies were rejected by the Droll. Even now, there were still Droll hiding in the dark to monitor the wizards' actions, preventing them from carrying out some terrible experiments that could cause large-scale natural disasters. Sometimes they would also take care of the plagues and diseases spread by the fallen. Soren walked back along the road. Soon he saw the village that he had seen at the beginning. Torches were lit on all sides of the village, and he could vaguely see the defense of the arrow towers. "Who is it?" a sturdy man shouted. Soren's figure emerged from the night. He raised his hands to show that he wasn't holding any weapons and said, "Human, a traveling adventurer. I just encountered a group of kobolds and am a little injured. I hope I can rest here for the night." After seeing Soren's appearance, the man on the watchtower relaxed a little. He shouted down, and soon a man wearing leather armor appeared. He seemed to be the captain of the militia here. It was a man with a full beard, estimated to be in his 30s or 40s. He frowned and looked at Soren, then asked, "Are you alone? It's not suitable for a person to move around in the wilderness." This was a former adventurer, and he obviously had a lot of experience. Although he knew Soren's profession, he was still very vigilant. "Yes, I'm alone." Soren put down his hands and replied, "I want to train my abilities and find the possibility of further improvement. So I'm alone in the wilderness." The captain hesitated for a moment, then waved his hand to signal the others to open the gate. He then said, "You can rest here for the night, but I hope you won't cause us any trouble." "There won't be any trouble," Soren smiled and said in a deep voice, "I'll leave tomorrow to hunt the nearby monsters. If it's possible, I hope you can tell me the distribution of the nearby monsters." The creatures in the wilderness naturally wouldn't just stay in one place. Only the natives in the area knew where they lived, so it was important to explore the wilderness and gather information. Sometimes it could save a lot of trouble. The heavy gate of the stronghold slowly opened. 5 or 6 adult men stood nearby with weapons in their hands. Their eyes were still very vigilant as they looked at Soren. They were slightly relieved when they saw that Soren did not make any movements after coming in. The captain climbed down from the watchtower and looked at Soren from head to toe. His eyes fell on his bandaged wounds, then he said, "It's rare to see a lone adventurer like you. I didn't expect a rogue to be like a monk." Soren smiled and didn't answer the question. The captain waved his hand to his companions, then pointed to the side and said, "Stranger, we can't trust you completely. So no one will take you in for the night. There's a firewood shed over there. If you don't mind, you can stay there for the night. I'll have someone send you some hot soup and food." Soren nodded and bowed slightly. "Thank you very much. I just need a place where I can sleep without worry. After all, it's easy to be ambushed in the wilderness." The captain nodded and asked a young man to lead him there. After Soren left, an adult man next to him said, "Captain? Is he okay? He's a stranger after all. He should be fine." The captain looked behind him and said in a low voice, "I'll go and test him later to see if he really killed a group of kobolds. It's getting more and more dangerous here. If someone can kill some of the monsters, we'll be under less pressure." The wilderness was dangerous. They built a village here to avoid a lot of taxes, but they also had to face a lot of trouble. The captain of the militia came over with 2 men. Soren rested on the soft grass and bandaged the wound on his leg. It was almost healed. There shouldn't be any problems tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect his upcoming battle. The armed forces of this village weren't weak. Soren saw a few second-grade warriors, and there should be experienced adventurers among them. They brought him some hot soup, some dry bread and some pickled vegetables. The one who brought them over was a chubby girl with freckles on her face. She looked at Soren curiously and blushed slightly when she saw his handsome face. She seemed like a simple village girl. She seemed to want to stay and listen to what they had to say, but the captain glared at her and she obediently went back to sleep. Before she left, she looked back at Soren. Young people like her were always curious about adventurers. Soren thanked her softly and took a sip of the soup. There were mushrooms and vegetables in it, and the bread needed to be soaked in it. It was natural to feel uncomfortable eating too much dry food. As he ate, he answered the other party's questions and probing questions. This wasn't surprising. After all, he was a stranger. "You said you killed a large group of kobolds?" The young man next to him looked doubtful, as if he didn't believe Soren had such strength. He wasn't interested in explaining, so he pulled out his curved sword and cut a piece of wood into 4 pieces. This time, the young man finally shut his mouth and looked at him with a trace of respect. Soren had used up a lot of energy. He finished the soup and bread and chewed some jerky before he stood up and said, "I want to know about the distribution of monsters nearby. Can you provide me with some information?" The captain had already put down his doubts and nodded. "No problem. There are many monsters around here, and we've been hoping that someone can deal with them. You can come here to rest at any time. I'll have someone prepare food and a place for you to sleep. It's late now. If you don't mind, you can sleep in my house for the night. I'll get someone to prepare a room for you in 2 days." Soren smiled and shook his head. He patted the pile of grass and said, "No need. This place is good. I'm used to it. Now tell me where the monsters are." Chapter 58. The sky was just beginning to brighten. A silhouette shuttled through the dense forest. The forest was truly a primeval forest, and there were no signs of roads at all. If it weren't for Soren's sturdy clothes, his clothes would have been torn a few times already. There were all kinds of small animals in the forest. Squirrels and rabbits were the most common, followed by all kinds of birds. It had to be said that a place without human activity was full of vitality. No wonder the druids were so against others destroying the forest. They had even fought several times because of this and killed many people. Soren quickly arrived at the edge of the forest, following the directions given by the militia captain. It was around noon. There were obvious signs of logging nearby. Intelligent creatures in the wilderness would build their own settlements, and some large groups of gnolls would even build their own camps. Soren didn't dare to get too close because his current stealth couldn't achieve the same effect as invisibility. It was just that he would become hazy in the shadows, and no one would be able to see him unless they looked carefully. As for sneaking up behind an enemy, that required skill and the environment, especially when dealing with hostile creatures. Invisibility didn't really mean that one would disappear. Enemies with sharp senses could still sense that someone was approaching. The biggest advantage of stealth was that one could hide in the shadows at any time. Most of the time, once one left the enemy's line of sight, it wouldn't be easy for them to find you again. Although backstab was a powerful ability, it required a lot of conditions to activate it. Soren followed the shadows and circled around the area. He found 3 gnoll guards. Large groups of gnolls included the old, the weak, women, and children. When the adults went out to hunt, some would stay behind to guard them. The gnolls didn't have houses in their settlements. They were just surrounded by a circle of wood. They knew how to make fires and equipment, but they were limited to making leather armor. Female jackaloons would peel off the skin of their prey and sew it into leather armor using crude methods. Some gnolls would use weapons in battle, and those who hadn't advanced would use claws and teeth. There are 3 guards. There should be quite a few of them. Soren took out his crossbow and loaded it with a poisoned bolt. It was impossible to sneak in during the day because the vision was too good. The gnolls would be able to spot him as soon as they saw him. He needed 150 points in stealth to achieve the same effect as invisibility, and he had to be in the shadows. He was still a few dozen points away from that. Although the invisibility effect was invisible to the eyes, the slight sound of movement and the flow of air were still there. Therefore, to deal with enemies who had the blind warfare specialty and high perceptive sense, the skill points needed to be very high. Soren's goal was to earn slaughter EXP, not to clear out this group of gnolls. Naturally, there was no need for him to attack the camp. He circled around and hid in the nearby bushes, then crawled on the ground and slowly crept towards the camp. Even with invisibility, it would be useless to walk over directly. The footprints and the things you stepped on would expose your position. It would be even more obvious if there was water on the ground. When wizards cast invisibility, they would combine it with lighten and instant slither. There were some creatures in the shadow plane that were permanently invisible. Soren had fought against them before and they were very difficult to deal with. The gnolls were wearing leather armor. Soren frowned and moved closer. If he didn't hit any vital points, the damage of the crossbow would be reduced. Even if he didn't want to kill the enemy with the crossbow, he still needed to ensure that the poison could seep into the enemy's blood. Swoosh! A gnoll suddenly screamed. The nearby guards were alarmed, and there was even a commotion from within the camp. Soren quickly reloaded his crossbow and shot at another gnoll. The wyvern's poison would take effect quickly. He pulled out his curved sword and rushed over. These gnolls were level 3 creatures, and often had the strength of a level 1 to level 3 warrior. It wouldn't be easy to deal with them. Oh whoa! Faced with Soren's surprise attack, the gnolls' first reaction wasn't to surround him, but to howl and call for their companions. The gnolls wouldn't stay in the camp all the time. They would search for prey during the day. If it was a wild beast, they would try to kill it. If it was a humanoid creature, they would secretly follow it and then ambush it in the evening or night. As carnivores, they had huge appetites. No matter how much prey there was, they could finish it all. When they were very hungry, they would also eat grass and mushrooms. Gnolls spent most of their time hunting and preparing to hunt. A gnoll's appetite was equivalent to that of an adult tiger. They were the most greedy and hungry wild creatures. There were 3 adult gnolls. One used claws and fangs, one was equipped with a bone crusher hammer, and one used a simple mace. Soren's advantage wasn't that obvious. These creatures were around 2 meters tall and weighed around 300 pounds. Their heads were similar to a coyote's and their skin was mostly gray. The color of their mane was messy, but their overall color was darker. Their strength and agility were higher than humans and could reach 15 points or more. However, their intelligence was lower. There were also priests who worshipped the gnoll god, but wizards and sorcerers were rare. A wolf howl came from afar. Soren raised his curved sword and slashed down. The sword slashed at the gnoll's arm, cutting off half of its claw. There was a muffled sound of wind breaking behind him. He had no time to dodge, so he could only roll forward. At the same time, he slashed at the gnoll's ankle. There was only 1/3 of the wyvern's venom left, and he had already smeared it on his scimitar. Bam! The mace hit the ground, creating a crater. If it had hit the head, it would have splashed brain matter. Many gnolls liked to use heavy weapons because it was convenient to crush bones. Bone marrow was the most delicious food for gnolls. A jackalen that was obviously smaller in size rushed out, along with 2 small aardwolves. Shadow strike. Soren had already predicted the number of enemies. He turned around and killed the first gnoll that was poisoned. A row of data appeared. Gnoll warrior killed. Target killed. Obtained 270 slaughter EXP. Whoosh! The sound of a weapon piercing through the air was heard. Soren waved his sword to block the attack, and his figure stepped back slightly. In an instant, he kicked his legs and rushed forward, directly crashing into the gnoll's arms. A disgusting stench and fishy smell assailed his nostrils. Without hesitation, he stabbed his curved sword into the gnoll's abdomen, then twisted his waist and directly cut a 20-centimeter long wound. A large amount of blood and intestines overflowed. The gnoll was severely injured, but it didn't die. It stuffed its intestines back in with its claws and swung the bone crusher mace again. A throwing knife was thrown. It hit the gnoll's throat in an instant. This was the last straw that broke the enemy's back. The gnoll roared and fell to the ground. Blood and intestines spilled on the ground. The coyote howled and pounced on Soren's leg. Soren twisted his body and kicked the coyote away. Then he used his curved sword to block the coyote's attack from the side. The heavy force forced him to kneel on one knee and deflect the coyote's weapon. At the same time, he twisted his body and stepped forward, cutting a wound on the coyote's leg with his curved sword. Another coyote pounced on him and bit his throat with its bloody mouth. Soren smashed the gnoll's nose with the hilt of his sword. Blood splashed out. Although the wound wasn't fatal, the gnoll howled in pain and retreated. Wolf howls could be heard from afar. It seemed that the gnolls were coming back from their hunt. Soren rushed toward the last gnoll warrior. The wyvern's venom had begun to take effect, and the gnoll's reaction speed had obviously slowed down. Die. Soren slid forward on his knees to avoid the gnoll's mace. He then held his curved sword with both hands and slashed at the gnoll's leg. The gnoll lost its balance. Blood spurted out and one of its legs was cut off. Clang. The smaller she-wolf pounced on Soren and pushed him to the ground. Its sharp fangs were about to bite his throat. However, Soren turned his head in an instant. The she-wolf bit into the leather armor on his shoulder. The sharp fangs pierced through the leather armor, but it didn't hurt the shoulder. It only bit through the skin. Blood splashed. Soren kicked the she-wolf with all his strength. As he kicked the she-wolf away, he held his curved sword and chopped off the head of the gnoll. Swoosh. He calmly reloaded his crossbow and killed the last gnoll guard that crawled over. The gnoll screamed and ran away, but he shot it in the waist. The gnolls in the distance had returned. The sound was about 500 meters away from Soren. He gripped his curved sword tightly and entered the camp. A group of gnolls stared at him fiercely. They let out threatening growls from time to time. Blood splashed. Soren swung his sword and killed 5 gnolls that were less than 2 years old. He then quickly ran into the forest and blended into the shadows. The battle had just begun. He wanted to make the gnolls lose their minds. Only then could he kill more of them. Chapter 59. 1, 2, 3. The gnolls that had gone out to hunt returned to the camp. The strong leader with a scar on his face found the bodies outside and roared angrily. It had fought with adventurers before, and its intelligence as a humanoid creature made it realize that adventurers had attacked their camp. These adventurers had mercilessly slaughtered the descendants of their tribe, just as they had mercilessly eaten the poor humans. There were only a few enemies and they ran away as soon as they noticed their return. 12 gnolls gradually gathered. This was a medium-sized gnoll group. More than half of them were adult gnolls, a third of them were warriors and a small number of them were newborns. With their talents, they had tamed 3 aardwolves which could be used as helpers when they hunted, and they could also be used as food reserves when they ran out of food. For gnolls, hunger could overwhelm everything. Even the weakest of their kind could be turned into food when they needed it. They were born warriors and scouts and they could follow the smell of blood. The leader of the gnolls came to the dead body of the female wolf. There was not much difference between males and females in the group, only a difference in size. Male gnolls were usually stronger, and female gnolls would only show some obvious characteristics when they were breastfeeding. It leaned over and sniffed the she-wolf's fangs, which were stained with Sauron's blood. Then it lifted the she-wolf, which weighed 200 to 300 pounds, with one hand and let all the gnolls smell it. They could remember the smell of blood for half a day, and they could follow the smell of blood within a 1-kilometer radius. Revenge. This was the instinct of humanoid creatures. Just like how humans would take revenge for their companions who had been eaten, they would also take revenge for their dead pups. The howls of the wolves rose and fell one after another. The gnolls began to follow the smell of blood. They were not the strongest creatures in the wilderness, but they were definitely the most vicious and annoying ones. The instincts of wolves allowed them to form packs and obey the orders of their own kind. Their innate bestial instincts allowed them to hunt and kill their prey. Adult gnolls had a monster level of 3, and as long as they succeeded in evolving, they would be close to grade 2 warriors. When they moved in packs, they would even hunt more dangerous creatures when they were hungry. The only thing that determined the size of a gnoll group was food. As long as there was enough food, a female wolf could give birth to more than 10 pups in a year. If there was a shortage of food, only the leader had the right to mate. In order to ensure that the strongest offspring would be born, the other Jack Allen members would not be able to give birth to offspring, and they would have to raise them together. This was very similar to many wolf packs. In the dense forest, Soren's figure was moving quickly. In the wilderness, only rangers could easily shake off gnolls. They had the ability to track the scent of blood, so it was only a matter of time before they discovered Soren's tracks. These were just gnolls in the material plane. In the outer plane there were even gnolls called bloodthirsters. They could track the smell of blood within a range of 10 kilometers. These creatures were dangerous predators and assassins. Their diet included low-level dragons. A group of jackals rushed into the forest and followed the scent of blood. Soren needed more favorable terrain. He could face more than 10 kobolds at once, but he could not face more than 10 gnolls at the same time. His stamina was gradually depleted as he ran. Soren's 20 points of constitution ensured his stamina. On the contrary, the gnolls began to slow down after chasing for 1 or 2 kilometers. The dense forest greatly affected one's speed. Even gnolls could not sprint at high speeds. Soren was also affected, but he had the excellent jumping ability and reflexes brought by his dexterity. His sense of balance, which was beyond the limits of a normal person, allowed him to avoid most obstacles. When there was a bush in front of him, he could even jump up and use the tree branches as leverage. It was as if one had been buffed with lightning, while the other had to run on the ground. The terrain in front of him gradually widened, and a mountain peak appeared in front of him. It was a 90-degree cliff, and there were some 3-foot-wide faults. Soren suddenly jumped up and grabbed the rock with both hands to climb up. Just like a climbing madman who challenged the limits of human beings in his previous life, Soren climbed all the way up the cliff with an unusually agile speed, and then stood about 20 meters above the ground. The area where he could move around was very small. He could climb all the way to the top of the mountain from the side. The mountain peak was not very high and there were only bare rocks on top. Soren applied some ointment to the wound on his shoulder, and then began to reload his crossbow. He put the bolts one by one into the small pouch on his waist, where he originally stored throwing knives. The best way to deal with jack-o'-lanterns was to avoid open terrain and be surrounded by them. If a group of jack-o'-lanterns surrounded him, even a high-grade warrior would have to take a few hits, let alone a Tier 2 thief. Traps were only useful in specific areas. Adventurers rarely spent too much time setting up traps in the wilderness. Rogues were more like warriors who relied on their dexterity to fight in the wilderness. This was why there was an advanced branch of the Rogue Blade Master class, which was a very powerful AoE class. The bushes in the distance shook and then a group of strong jack-o'-lanterns came out. The leader was a jack-o'-lantern with a scar on his face. The scar extended from his forehead to the side of his face. If it had been a little more slanted, his eyes would have been destroyed. They're finally here. Soren hung the crossbow on his waist, and then took out a bloody wolf's head from his multi-dimensional pouch. It was the head of a jack-o'-lantern cub. He put it in his pocket before he left. Oh, whoa, whoa. The howls of the jack-o'-lanterns rose and fell one after another. The jack-o'-lantern's eyes were bloodshot. They howled and pounced on him, wanting to climb up the wall and tear him to pieces. Taunt successful. Swoosh. A crossbow bolt flew out and the gnoll at the front staggered, rolling and hitting the cliff. Soren calmly reloaded the crossbow and then hid behind a rock. He then aimed at the jack-o'-lantern again and shot an arrow at its head. It hit the skull and the arrow directly nailed into it. A row of data appeared. Killed jack-o'-lantern warrior. Dealt 36 lethal damage. Target killed. Received 320 slaughter EXP. It had a range of 20 meters. The base damage of the crossbow could reach up to 20, and if it hit a vital point it would instantly kill the target. The jack-o'-lanterns were fast climbers, but it wasn't easy to climb the 90-degree cliff. Before the jack-o'-lanterns could reach him, Soren had already finished reloading the crossbow, and shot an arrow from above. The jack-o'-lanterns that were climbing had no room to dodge. One of them was shot in the neck and fell down, dying in an instant. Another one was shot in the forehead and died on the spot. Whoa! The jack-o'-lantern's leader howled, and the other jack-o'-lanterns finally realized that the terrain was very unfavorable for them. Some of them hid in the blind spots of Soren's shooting range, while the others flanked Soren from both sides. They climbed up the side of the cliff, preparing to ambush Soren from both sides and from above. Damn it! Their reactions are fast. Soren put away the crossbow. He threw the head of the jack-o'-lantern pup down and then climbed up the cliff. Although the jack-o'-lanterns weren't very intelligent, they wouldn't just stand there and wait for him to kill them one by one. If the jack-o'-lanterns attacked him, Soren could kill 5 or 6 of them first, but if they surrounded him from the side, he had no choice but to change his position. Soren was able to jump up to the second floor, and his jumping ability was even better than the elves. He jumped up and grabbed onto a rock, then did a 360-degree flip and landed on the top of the cliff. He quickly picked up the crossbow, reloaded it, and shot at the jack-o'-lanterns that were climbing up the cliff. The jack-o'-lanterns were alert enough to dodge and the crossbow hit a rock. Clang. Soren wasn't surprised. He pulled out his scimitar, looked at the jack-o'-lanterns that were surrounding him, and rushed towards the closest one. The terrain here was good. If the jack-o'-lanterns were grouped together he could slowly kill them. If they were scattered he could kill them alone. At least he didn't have to face 3 or 5 of them at once. It was a pity that he didn't have the forest walk ability, or he would be able to kill them in the forest. The Elven Ranger's favorite thing to do was to jump from tree to tree and kill enemies with their longbows. A Jack Allen gave him nearly 300 slaughter EXP, and he would be able to take out half of them. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.